Tonight, we're traveling back 100 million years to the Cretaceous rivers, a time when vast, untamed waterways carved across continents, giving rise to one of the strangest ecosystems our planet has ever known. In what is now the Sahara Desert in Africa, water shaped a landscape unlike anything alive today. Rivers broader than the Mississippi wound their way through tangled forests and endless floodplains, feeding a realm so rich, so violent, and so strange that scientists call it a lost world. These were not ordinary waterways, they were entire worlds unto themselves. Their banks teemed with life, and their depths hid creatures that defied everything we thought we knew about evolution. Fish the size of cars glided through the currents. Crocodiles longer than buses waited motionless at the edges, ready to drag dinosaurs into the dark. And at the top of this strange hierarchy was a hunter unlike any the earth had seen before. Spinosaurus, standing taller and longer than T-Rex, yet it was no land-stalking hunter. It ruled the rivers, built not for chasing prey across plains, but for slipping silently beneath the water's surface, its sail cutting through the shallows, jaws snapping through the current in search of a meal. This was a world where familiar rules broke down, where apex predators swam instead of ran, where forests gave way to floodplains, and where life's greatest battles were fought beneath the surface rather than above it. And then, this entire world disappeared. The rivers dried, the forests vanished, the monsters were forgotten, buried beneath shifting sands, their bones were scattered and erased, some destroyed by time, others destroyed in a bombing raid during World War II, and many simply waiting, undisturbed beneath the desert sand. But piece by piece, scientists are rediscovering what once was, and with every fossil uncovered, the shape of this forgotten world becomes clearer, a place where evolution stretched its imagination, where ecosystems thrived in ways we are only just beginning to understand. Tonight, we'll follow the faint echoes of this forgotten realm. We'll trace the winding paths of vanished rivers. We'll meet the apex predators that once ruled them, and we'll step into a world that was never meant to exist, a world that thrived, vanished, and still whispers beneath the sands. If you're already enjoying this gentle space, it would mean a lot if you gave this video a soft like, maybe even subscribed, if you'd like more slow science stories like this. And if you feel comfortable sharing, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far across the world these stories travel. So now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and let's begin our journey into the lost world of Cretaceous rivers. To understand the lost world of the Cretaceous rivers, we must first journey far beyond our own timeline, back to a version of Earth so transformed that it feels like another planet altogether. 100 million years ago, in the heart of the mid-Cretaceous period, our world was still assembling itself. Continents drifted slowly across the globe, oceans crept inland, and the air itself carried a chemical makeup and weight we would barely recognize. The first sensation in this ancient world would be the warmth. Earth was deep inside a greenhouse phase, and by modern standards it was extreme. Carbon dioxide levels were several times higher than today, trapping heat beneath a dense atmospheric blanket. Global temperatures were on average more than 10 degrees Celsius warmer than those we know. Winters, where they existed at all, were mild and damp. There were no permanent polar ice caps. Instead, forests stretched to the edges of the planet, filling high latitudes with towering conifers, redwoods, and ferns. Fossilized tree stumps found in what is now the Canadian Arctic still bear the marks of those forests, proof that even months of darkness could not hold back the warmth. The effects of this climate were everywhere. High temperatures melted ancient ice and raised sea levels hundreds of feet above what they are now. Low-lying regions vanished beneath shallow seas. Vast inland waterways split continents apart, turning familiar land masses into island chains and archipelagos. The geography of the world was constantly changing, reshaped by the rise and fall of water. Wind and weather patterns were different too. The stronger greenhouse effect meant that warm air held more moisture, and that moisture was carried far from the coasts. Regions that are deserts today were once swept by storms and steady rains. Clouds gathered over interior plains and released torrents of water across landscapes that had never before felt such abundance. This global circulation system meant that much of the planet remained green and fertile, even far from the shorelines. The land itself was also on the move. Africa, for instance, looked nothing like the continent we know. For hundreds of millions of years, it had been bound to other landmasses as part of the southern supercontinent Gondwana. But by the mid-Cretaceous, this colossal landmass was breaking apart. Deep beneath the crust, molten rock surged upward, tearing the supercontinent into drifting fragments. These tectonic plates moved slowly but irresistibly, dragging entire continents along at the pace of a few centimeters each year. Africa was being carried northward, setting the stage for future collisions that would raise the Alps and carve out the Mediterranean. This slow continental rearrangement reshaped the surface of the planet in countless ways. As Gondwana fractured, rifts and basins formed across its interior. Many were flooded by encroaching seas or filled with sediment carried by runoff. Some became the foundations of future deserts or mountain belts, and as continents shifted position, their climate belts shifted too. Africa's journey northward brought it deeper into the path of tropical winds and monsoon systems, intensifying its seasonal rains and shaping the environments that would emerge there. The combined force of these changes produced a planet bursting with ecological diversity. New coastlines appeared where seas advanced. Warm, shallow waters teemed with plankton and ammonites. Inland plains, nourished by heavy rainfall, became blanketed with dense plant life. Flowering plants, still relatively new to Earth, began to spread quickly, transforming ecosystems and paving the way for new kinds of insect pollinators. Even at the poles, temperate forests thrived, and rivers of meltwater flowed beneath a sky that never knew the cold we now associate with those regions. It is difficult to picture such a world when we look at our planet today. Where icy wastelands stretch across the poles, there were once wetlands and forests. Where continents are sharply defined, there were once inland seas and drowned shorelines. The world was wetter, greener, and warmer, a place where climate, geography, and biology were deeply intertwined. The Earth itself was alive and restless, its continents drifting, its atmosphere evolving, and its ecosystems expanding into every available space. This was the stage upon which the story of the Cretaceous rivers would unfold. The planet's warmth, its changing geography, and its atmospheric engine created the conditions for vast networks of freshwater systems to form. Before the first of those rivers carved their way across the land, before they became the heart of ancient ecosystems, Earth itself had to become a world capable of sustaining them. It was a planet in transition, reshaped by heat and water, and it was this restless, dynamic Earth that gave rise to one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of life. Today, the Sahara stretches like an endless ocean of silence. Wind shapes its surface into golden waves that shift and collapse like tides, and the sun scorches the land until the air itself seems to shimmer. It is a place defined by absence of water, of shade, of anything soft or green. Yet, hidden beneath this emptiness is a record of a world that once was. Long before this land became a desert, it was alive with water and dense with life. Rivers once cut through its heart, lakes spread like inland seas, and whole ecosystems flourished in places that now see only dust and wind. The memory of that vanished world is etched into the land itself. Across northern Africa, satellite images reveal the faint outlines of river channels buried beneath the sand. Some stretch for hundreds of kilometers, their winding paths preserved like ghostly scars from a wetter age. They trace the roots of ancient waterways that once linked upland streams to vast floodplains and deltas. Scientists follow these patterns to other clues hidden beneath the dunes, layers of soil long sealed away from the surface, still threaded with fossilized roots from trees that once lined the riverbanks. These roots do not belong to hardy desert shrubs. They come from plants that required abundant water, dense gallery forests, marsh-loving vegetation, and lush undergrowth that could only have thrived in a landscape sustained by steady rainfall. In other layers, the Earth's memory runs even deeper. Sediments preserved from this ancient time are rich with traces of freshwater life. Microscopic shells of plankton and algae are sealed within layers of mudstone and silt. Scales from ancient fish and the pollen of wetland plants still cling to grains of rock. These delicate clues reveal that the region was once dominated by vast networks of rivers, lakes, and marshes. They also tell us that this was not a fleeting episode of wetness. Water flowed here for millions of years, returning season after season, nourishing a complex ecosystem that endured far longer than human civilization has existed. The source of this abundance lay high above, in the patterns of the ancient sky. During the mid-Cretaceous, Earth's atmosphere was heavy with moisture, and weather systems behaved differently than they do today. Powerful monsoon winds formed as warm air rose over the land, pulling in water vapor from nearby seas. That moisture condensed into towering clouds that released torrents of rain across the continent. The rainfall was not rare or unpredictable. It came with the regularity of the seasons, drenching the land year after year and feeding a continuous hydrological cycle. Rivers swelled with each wet season and retreated slightly in the dry, but the land never truly dried out. This rhythmic pulse of water shaped the landscape in profound ways. Rain collected in low-lying basins and hollows, forming broad lakes and swampy wetlands. Streams merged and braided into large waterways that wound slowly across the plains, often spreading far beyond their banks during peak rains. These seasonal floods deposited rich layers of silt that fertilized the soil, allowing vegetation to grow thick and tall. Forests crowded along the water's edge, their roots binding the banks and shading the channels. Beyond them stretched wide expanses of grasslands and fern meadows, punctuated by stands of cycads and early flowering plants. The land would have appeared more like a tropical river valley than the desolate desert we see today. This transformation created an environment that teemed with life. Freshwater fish thrived in the rivers and lakes, some growing to sizes that would dwarf their modern relatives. Amphibians and turtles flourished in the shallows. Massive crocodilian predators lurked in the muddy margins, while pterosaurs swept overhead, searching for fish near the surface. Dinosaurs of all sizes were drawn to the water's edge to graze on vegetation or hunt prey. Even small organisms, from insects to mollusks, found niches in this network of habitats. The abundance of water and the variety of environments it created allowed life to diversify and specialize, filling every available space. The evidence of this lush world is still there, buried beneath the dunes. Each ancient river channel, each layer of pollen-rich sediment, and each fossilized root is a piece of a story almost erased by time. Together they tell us that the Sahara was once a place of renewal, where rains returned with the seasons and water shaped everything it touched. It was a land where wetlands stretched for hundreds of kilometers, where forests rose along forgotten banks, and where life thrived in forms both familiar and strange. And though the surface is now silent and barren, The stone below still remembers the age when northern Africa was green, wet, and alive. By the time the rivers of the mid-Cretaceous carved their way across the land, they were already immense, complex systems that pulsed through the landscape like arteries through a living body. They were not simple channels of flowing water, but dynamic worlds in constant motion, reshaping the ground they crossed and sustaining entire webs of life. These rivers had no single form. They shifted, split and braided across the plains, spreading their influence far beyond the banks visible from the surface. From the air, a Cretaceous river system would have appeared like a living network, its channels branching and weaving together as they snaked toward distant basins. Many of them were braided rivers, formed when powerful currents carried heavy loads of silt and sand downstream. As the flow slowed or shifted, sediments piled up and split the water into many smaller threads, which rejoined and separated again and again. These channels were never fixed. A flood in one season might erase an old path, while the next would carve a new one, creating a shifting, tangled web of waterways that rewrote the land's surface year after year. At the heart of this system lay vast floodplains that stretched as far as the eye could see. When the rivers swelled during wet seasons, water spilled out of its channels and spread across these low-lying plains, carrying with it a rich cargo of nutrients. As the waters receded, they left behind fresh layers of fertile silt and clay, building soils that nourished dense vegetation. Fern groves and cycads flourished in these deposits, along with the first great forests of flowering plants. The floodplain was never static. New vegetation rose where old channels once ran, and new waterways sliced through regions that had once been dry. This ever-changing mosaic of habitats created niches for countless species, each adapted to a slightly different patch of this watery landscape. The rivers did not flow as single steady streams. They were alive with features that shaped how life interacted with them. In places where the current curved sharply, the water's momentum carved deep meanders that looped through the land like coils of rope. When a bend became too extreme, the river sometimes cut through the narrow neck of land and abandoned its old path. The result was an oxbow lake, a crescent of still water cut off from the main flow. These quiet backwaters became nurseries for young fish and amphibians, protected from the turbulence of the main channel. Reeds and water plants crowded their margins, while flying reptiles and primitive birds circled overhead, drawn by the abundance of prey. Farther downstream, the rivers often fanned out into enormous deltas, where the current slowed and dropped its heavy load of sediment. These were sprawling wetlands of branching channels, muddy islands, and shallow lagoons. In these nutrient-rich waters, microscopic algae formed the foundation of a food web that supported everything from swarming fish to massive herbivorous dinosaurs grazing on the lush vegetation along the shores. Every flood season, the river added new layers to the delta, reshaping its structure and expanding its reach into the surrounding lowlands. For life, these rivers were more than water. They were corridors that linked distant habitats and acted as highways for migration. Dinosaurs followed their courses to find food and breeding grounds. Reptiles and amphibians nested along their edges. Fish swam upstream to spawn in protected shallows, and the currents themselves carried seeds far beyond their parent plants, allowing vegetation to colonize new ground. The rivers shaped the distribution of species across entire regions, bringing together organisms that might otherwise never have crossed paths. Yet the same rivers that connected could also divide. As they shifted course or split into separate branches, they isolated populations from one another. A group of fish trapped in an oxbow lake might diverge from its relatives in the main current, evolving unique adaptations to their still water environment. Populations of herbivorous dinosaurs separated by a new channel might slowly evolve into distinct species, each shaped by slightly different pressures. In this way, the rivers acted as both bridges and boundaries, guiding the evolutionary path of life through connection and separation alike. Their unpredictable rhythms imposed constant challenges. A single flood could wipe away a nesting ground. A season of drought could shrink a mighty waterway into a chain of shallow pools, forcing predators and prey into sudden, intense competition. Species that endured such pressures often did so by evolving sharper senses, more efficient hunting strategies, or flexible diets. Over generations, these adaptations sculpted the bodies and behaviors of creatures that called the river home, creating forms exquisitely tuned to a life of constant change. Predators found endless opportunity within this shifting world. Spinosaurus patrolled the labyrinth of channels, its body adapted for hunting fish in deep water. Sarcosuchus, a crocodilian giant, lurked along the muddy banks, launching explosive ambushes on anything that ventured too close. Above them, pterosaurs soared low over the surface, diving to snatch prey from the water below. Even small predators thrived here, stalking the undergrowth or scavenging along the shores. The river shaped their movements, their strategies, and their very survival. Every meander, every floodplain, every shifting channel was part of a vast living system that touched nearly every form of life around it. These rivers did not merely run through the landscape, they built it, layer by layer, over millions of years, and in doing so, they shaped the very course of evolution itself. Long before scientists could reconstruct the vanished world of the Cretaceous rivers, they had only fragments to guide them. At first, these were nothing more than scattered bones, eroding from sandstone under the relentless desert sun. Each piece was a mystery unto itself, offering glimpses of a story that was far larger and more complex than anyone could yet imagine. The process of uncovering that story would unfold over more than a century, a slow and careful excavation, not just of fossils, but of an entire forgotten ecosystem. In the early decades of the 20th century, a German paleontologist named Ernst Stromer journeyed deep into the remote Bahariya oasis of Egypt. The region was harsh and remote, yet it promised something extraordinary. Local accounts told of strange bones weathering from the ground, and Stromer was determined to find them. Over the course of several expeditions in the 1910s and 1920s, he and his team unearthed fossils that defied expectations. Among them were the remains of a predator unlike any previously discovered. Its vertebrae towered like the spines of a ship's sail, and its teeth were long and conical, shaped more like those of a crocodile than a land-dwelling hunter. Stromer gave it a name, Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. Even with only partial remains, it was clear this animal had lived a life very different from most of its kin. Yet the fossil record was incomplete, and for decades scientists had little more to work with than Stromer's field notes and sketches. It was as though the bones had offered a single tantalizing sentence from a story thousands of pages long. The ground, however, still held many more pages. As the 20th century went on, expeditions returned to the Bahariya Formation and to other fossil-rich deposits scattered across northern Africa. They began uncovering not just the bones of Spinosaurus, but traces of an entire vanished community. Enormous fish scales surfaced from ancient sediments, evidence of freshwater giants that once swam through prehistoric channels. The armored jaws of crocodilian predators appeared, their teeth still lined with the scars of a life spent ambushing prey. Fossilized shells from turtles, amphibian limb bones, and fragments of flying reptile wings painted a picture of a thriving wetland ecosystem, one that had supported a diversity of life far greater than anyone had suspected. Each discovery hinted at a larger story. These were not the remains of creatures that had lived on dry plains or in forested uplands, they were the inhabitants of a vast freshwater realm, one defined by rivers, lakes, and swamps, and the more researchers uncovered, the clearer that picture became. What had once been imagined as a barren desert had millions of years earlier been a landscape shaped and sustained by water. In the past few decades, new technologies have transformed the search for this hidden world. High-resolution satellite imaging, capable of detecting subtle variations in topography and soil composition, has allowed scientists to map ancient river channels that lie buried beneath modern sands. From hundreds of kilometers above the Earth, faint outlines of braided waterways appear, tracing the paths of rivers that vanished tens of millions of years ago. These ghost channels reveal networks of floodplains, deltas, and inland basins that once formed the heart of a vibrant ecosystem. Ground-based technologies have been equally transformative. Ground-penetrating radar, for example, sends electromagnetic waves deep into the Earth, reflecting back signals that reveal buried structures without the need for excavation. Using this method, researchers can locate fossil-rich strata, identify sediment layers laid down by flowing water, and even detect subtle changes in soil chemistry that point to ancient flood events. Combined with detailed geochemical analysis, these tools allow scientists to reconstruct the environments in which these prehistoric creatures lived, the temperature of the water, the flow of the rivers, the seasonal rhythms of flooding and drought. Chemical signatures locked within fossilized bone and sediment tell their own stories. Isotopic ratios, preserved for tens of millions of years, reveal the diets of ancient animals and the sources of the water they depended on. They show that some predators fed almost exclusively on aquatic prey, while others were opportunists, thriving in the shifting boundary between land and water. Through these chemical fingerprints, scientists are learning not just who lived in this vanished ecosystem, but how they lived and interacted. All of these discoveries have fundamentally reshaped our understanding of the Cretaceous world. For much of the last century, paleontology imagined dinosaurs primarily as land-bound creatures roaming plains and forests. But the evidence from northern Africa has forced a profound shift in perspective. It reveals that some dinosaurs evolved in close partnership with freshwater environments, that rivers and wetlands were not just marginal habitats, but central arenas of evolution, and that ecosystems once flourished where deserts now reign. Every new fossil adds depth to that story. A fragment of a jawbone reveals a predator's diet. A cluster of fish scales hints at the structure of ancient food webs. A buried riverbed exposes the shape of the land itself. Piece by piece, these clues allow scientists to reconstruct a world that has been gone for nearly 100 million years, a world where water shaped everything, and where life followed its currents into extraordinary forms. For decades, the image of a dinosaur apex predator was a familiar one, a towering hunter with knife-like teeth and powerful legs, stalking its prey across the land. Creatures like Tyrannosaurus rex embodied that vision, dominating the prehistoric imagination as unstoppable land-based killers. But deep within the river systems of Cretaceous Africa, nature wrote a different story. Here, evolution shaped a predator that shattered every expectation, a creature so unusual that it forced scientists to rethink what dinosaurs could be. This was Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the river's undisputed ruler, and one of the strangest apex predators the planet has ever seen. Even its bones tell a story unlike any other. Spinosaurus was longer than T-Rex, stretching more than 50 feet from snout to tail. Its skull was narrow and elongated, shaped more like a crocodile's than a traditional theropod's. The jaws were lined with long, conical teeth that lacked the sharp, serrated edges typical of meat-eating dinosaurs. Instead of tearing flesh, these teeth were perfectly designed for gripping slippery prey like fish. Fossilized jaws even show tiny pressure sensors near the snout, similar to those found in modern crocodilians, which allow them to detect movement in the water. This was not the mouth of a land hunter. It was the tool of a predator that made its living beneath the surface. The body of Spinosaurus also broke the mold. Most theropods had hollow, lightweight bones to help them move quickly on land. Spinosaurus was different. Its bones were unusually dense and heavy, a feature more common in aquatic animals like penguins or hippos. This extra weight helped it stay submerged, countering the natural buoyancy that would have kept a lighter animal afloat. Instead of sprinting across plains, Spinosaurus was built to slip beneath the water's surface and remain there, moving with stealth and control. Its tail, too, told a story of aquatic adaptation. In the past, reconstructions often showed Spinosaurus with a tail like that of other theropods, stiff and tapered, useful for balance but not propulsion. But new fossil discoveries revealed something unexpected, a broad, paddle-like tail with tall, flexible spines. Experiments using robotic models of the tail showed that it could generate powerful thrust in water, functioning much like the tails of modern crocodiles or newts. This was a predator that did not merely wade into rivers. It swam. Other parts of its anatomy supported this semi-aquatic lifestyle. Its long, narrow limbs lacked the heavy musculature of a running hunter, suggesting it was less agile on land. Its nostrils sat farther back on its skull, allowing it to breathe while most of its head remained submerged. And the enormous sail rising from its back, formed by elongated neural spines, may have played a role in thermoregulation or display. But in water, it also acted as a stabilizer, helping the animal maintain balance as it maneuvered through the current. Scientific evidence beyond the bones strengthens the case for an aquatic life. Isotope analysis of Spinosaurus teeth has shown oxygen signatures that match those of semi-aquatic animals, indicating that it spent much of its time in water. Bone microstructure studies reveal density patterns similar to diving animals rather than land-dwelling predators. Combined with biomechanical models of its tail and limbs, the picture becomes clear. Spinosaurus was not just capable of swimming, it was specialized for it. This specialization transformed how scientists understand apex predators. Before Spinosaurus, the idea of a dinosaur ruling the waterways seemed far-fetched. Dinosaurs were land dwellers, while the aquatic realms were dominated by marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs. But Spinosaurus blurred that boundary. It was a dinosaur that abandoned the land as its primary hunting ground, carving out an ecological niche that no other large theropod had occupied. Its prey were not fleeing herbivores on dry ground, but massive fish that lurked in the depths of ancient rivers. The emergence of Spinosaurus also revealed how powerful evolutionary pressures can be in shaping life. The abundance of aquatic prey in the Cretaceous river systems created an opportunity, and Spinosaurus evolved to exploit it with unmatched efficiency. Over generations, its body became more streamlined, its bones heavier, its tail more powerful, and its senses more attuned to the watery world. It was no longer bound by the rules that defined its land-based cousins. Yet, despite its unusual features, Spinosaurus was no less fearsome. Fossil evidence suggests it grew larger than any other known theropod, reaching lengths of more than 50 feet and weights of 7 tons or more. Its powerful jaws could snap through thick fish skulls, and its tail-driven bursts of speed made it a deadly ambush predator beneath the surface. In a world where most dinosaurs ruled with speed and strength on land, Spinosaurus ruled with stealth and precision in the water. The discovery of this rule-breaking predator did more than add a new chapter to the dinosaur story. It reshaped the way scientists think about evolution, showing that even the most iconic groups of animals can adapt to unexpected environments. In the world of the Cretaceous rivers, Spinosaurus proved that dominance was not confined to the land. It was written in the currents, sculpted by water, and embodied in a creature that redefined what it meant to be an apex predator. For more than a century, scientists believed they understood the story of the great predatory dinosaurs. These were the masters of their worlds, swift and powerful, built to run down prey and tear it apart with bone-crushing jaws. Their realm was the land, their strategies were terrestrial, and their evolutionary story seemed to follow a single, confident path. From the Jurassic hunters like Allosaurus to the towering Tyrannosaurus rex, the pattern held steady. Theropods were land dwellers, apex predators defined by speed, strength, and dominance on solid ground. Then, Spinosaurus forced the story to change. At first, it was treated as an oddity, a curious branch on the theropod family tree. But as evidence mounted, the picture became more radical. Spinosaurus was not simply a predator with unusual features. It was a creature that had broken the fundamental rules of what it meant to be a dinosaur hunter. It did not fit neatly into the established categories scientists had relied on for decades. It did not hunt where most other theropods hunted, nor did it behave like them. It had carved out an ecological role so strange and so unexpected that its existence reshaped how scientists thought about evolution itself. The revelation was not just that Spinosaurus could swim, but that it lived a life deeply entwined with water. It was not a land predator that occasionally waded into rivers to snatch fish. It was a hunter that built its existence around the aquatic world, a specialist in an environment that most of its relatives ignored. That fact alone overturned long-held assumptions. For generations, paleontologists believed dinosaurs had rarely crossed into fully aquatic niches. Marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs had done so, but they were not dinosaurs. Spinosaurus blurred that line completely. It showed that even among the dominant land predators of their age, evolution could push a lineage back toward the water. The implications rippled far beyond the anatomy of one species. If a large theropod could evolve into a semi-aquatic predator, what other evolutionary experiments might have taken place in environments once thought off-limits to dinosaurs? If rivers and lakes could support creatures as specialized as Spinosaurus, then freshwater ecosystems were not just peripheral to dinosaur evolution, they were central arenas of adaptation and innovation. Spinosaurus also forced scientists to rethink how ecosystems themselves were structured. The traditional picture of the Cretaceous was one of clearly divided domains, land ruled by dinosaurs, seas by marine reptiles, skies by pterosaurs. But Spinosaurus dissolved those boundaries. It showed that ecosystems were not static compartments, but dynamic, interconnected systems where evolutionary pressures could pull species into new roles. Rivers were not merely borders between terrestrial and aquatic worlds. They were bridges, and in some cases, they became the heart of evolutionary change. This perspective changed how paleontologists interpreted other fossils too. Teeth once dismissed as belonging to crocodiles were re-examined and sometimes reassigned. Fossilized prey remains were reconsidered in light of a predator that hunted differently. Even trackways and sediment layers were reinterpreted with a new lens, one that recognized that dinosaurs might have interacted with aquatic environments in ways that had long gone unnoticed. The evolutionary story of Spinosaurus also revealed a deeper truth about adaptation. Evolution is not a straight line toward a predetermined goal. It is an ongoing experiment, a response to shifting opportunities and pressures. In the river-rich landscapes of mid-Cretaceous Africa, there was a wealth of prey beneath the water's surface. Most theropods ignored it, competing with each other for terrestrial herbivores. But Spinosaurus ventured into that unclaimed realm, and over millions of years, natural selection shaped it into a predator uniquely suited to that environment. Its existence was a vivid demonstration of how life can exploit opportunities others overlook. Even the enigmatic sail on its back, a feature that continues to spark debate, hints at this evolutionary creativity. Some scientists propose it helped regulate temperature during long periods spent in the water. Others think it was a display structure, used to communicate with rivals or attract mates. Whatever its purpose, it stands as a symbol of Spinosaurus's departure from the norm, an evolutionary experiment layered on top of an already radical shift in lifestyle. Perhaps the most profound impact of Spinosaurus was philosophical. It reminded scientists that their understanding of the past is always incomplete, that the fossil record is a patchwork full of surprises. It showed that even within groups as well studied as theropod dinosaurs, there are chapters of the evolutionary story still hidden, waiting to overturn assumptions and rewrite textbooks. And it revealed that evolution is far more versatile than even the most imaginative reconstructions had suggested. Spinosaurus was more than a predator that adapted to rivers. It was a signpost, pointing to the vast range of possibilities that life can explore when environmental pressures and evolutionary potential meet. It expanded the definition of what dinosaurs could be, proving that even the most dominant lineage on land could reinvent itself when opportunity called from the water's edge. In doing so, it did not just change how scientists saw one species, it changed how they understood the entire narrative of life on Earth. For all the power and mystery that surrounded Spinosaurus, it was not the only ruler of the Cretaceous rivers. In those same waters and along those same muddy banks, another predator watched from the shadows. It was ancient even in the age of dinosaurs, a relic of a lineage that had survived since the time of the first reptiles. It did not need to chase its prey or outsmart its rivals. It only needed patience, power, and the element of surprise. Scientists call it Sarcosuchus imperator, the flesh crocodile, but many simply call it by a name that captures its scale and ferocity, supercroc. At more than 40 feet long from snout to tail, Sarcosuchus was among the largest crocodilians to ever live. It outweighed a modern saltwater crocodile by several tons and stretched longer than a city bus. Its skull alone was nearly as long as a human is tall, and it was lined with over 100 conical teeth, each one designed for gripping, holding, and crushing. Unlike modern crocodiles, whose snouts are narrow and specialized for fish, Sarcosuchus had a broad, heavy skull built for power. Its jaws could deliver a bite force that may have exceeded 16,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone or splinter the armor of a young dinosaur. Life for Sarcosuchus was a game of patience. It did not chase its prey across the floodplains or stalk them through the forests. It waited, lying almost completely submerged in the shallows, its eyes and nostrils barely breaking the surface. It could remain motionless for hours. Prey animals approaching the river for a drink would see only still water. They would not notice the massive predator waiting beneath until it was too late. When the moment came, Sarcosuchus exploded from the water with astonishing speed. Its jaws clamped shut in less than a second, dragging even large prey into the depths with irresistible force. The fossil record offers silent but telling evidence of these encounters. Deep gouges on dinosaur bones found near ancient riverbanks match the spacing and shape of Sarcosuchus' teeth. Some show signs of violent twisting and crushing, patterns that occur when a crocodilian performs a death roll to dismember its prey. Even juveniles of large herbivorous dinosaurs were not safe. Tracks and bite marks suggest that Sarcosuchus targeted anything that came too close to the water's edge, from unwary hadrosaurs to small theropods. But Sarcosuchus was more than just a shoreline ambusher. It was a master of its environment. Fossil evidence suggests that it moved between deep channels and quiet oxbow lakes, sometimes venturing far from the main current to hunt or bask. Its heavy armor of bony plates, called osteoderms, helped regulate its body temperature and offered protection during battles with rivals. Its sense of smell was highly developed, allowing it to detect carrion or hidden prey beneath the water. Even its nostrils, perched high on its snout, allowed it to breathe while nearly invisible, blending perfectly with the surface of the river. In this watery world, Sarcosuchus and Spinosaurus lived side by side. Both were apex predators, and both dominated their surroundings. Yet they did not simply destroy one another in endless conflict. Instead, they carved out separate niches in the same ecosystem. Spinosaurus roamed the deeper channels, swimming through the current in pursuit of large fish, while Sarcosuchus preferred the river's edges, ambushing anything that ventured too close to land. Their hunting strategies, though overlapping at times, minimized direct competition. There may have been confrontations, a territorial dispute over a favored stretch of river, perhaps, or a battle over a carcass, but the fossil record suggests that the two giants were able to coexist for millions of years. This balance shaped the entire ecosystem around them. Prey species evolved behaviors to reduce their risk near the water. Herds may have developed strategies to approach rivers in coordinated groups, while young dinosaurs learned to stay far from the edges. Even the fish populations were likely influenced by the presence of these apex hunters, with smaller species seeking refuge in shallow areas and larger ones developing defensive behaviors or migration patterns. The presence of Sarcosuchus also influenced other predators. Smaller crocodilians and aquatic reptiles may have been forced into less desirable habitats, while opportunistic scavengers followed behind, feeding on the remains of its kills. In this way, the giant crocodile did more than hunt, it shaped the flow of life around it. The rise of Sarcosuchus is a testament to the success of its lineage. Crocodilians are among the most ancient of Earth's predators, their basic body plan largely unchanged for more than 200 million years. But Sarcosuchus took that design to an extreme. It was the embodiment of brute strength and patience, a hunter that relied not on speed or cunning, but on perfect timing and overwhelming force. And in the river systems of Cretaceous Africa, this strategy worked. For millions of years, Sarcosuchus reigned alongside Spinosaurus, two very different predators ruling the same watery kingdom. One was sleek, specialized, and adapted to chase prey through the current. The other was ancient, armored, and built to strike from stillness. Together, they defined the rivers as places of danger and power, where life and death were decided in an instant, and even the mightiest dinosaurs had reason to fear the water's edge. Beneath the surface of the Cretaceous rivers, hidden from the sunlit world above, life followed a slower and older rhythm. The water here moved gently, carrying fine silt and drifting plant matter, and in its dim depths, a parallel kingdom thrived. It was a world of giants, yet these were not dinosaurs or reptiles. They were ancient fish, relics of lineages that stretched back hundreds of millions of years, creatures that had weathered mass extinctions and shifting continents to dominate this underwater realm. And they were not just passengers in the ecosystem, they were architects of it, shaping its structure, its rhythms, and even the evolution of the predators that depended on them. One of the titans of this world was Mawsonia, a colossal coelacanth unlike anything alive today. Modern coelacanths are deep-sea curiosities, rarely glimpsed and modest in size. But Mawsonia was a heavyweight of freshwater life. It grew longer than a small car and weighed as much as several adult humans, its broad-lobed fins capable of slow, deliberate movements that allowed it to hover with uncanny precision in the current. Its physiology was not built for speed, but for endurance and control, an approach that made it a dominant presence in deep channels and still waters. Fossil evidence, from massive vertebrae to reinforced skull bones, hints at the sheer power contained within its body. These adaptations were not for chasing prey, but for outlasting threats, enduring environmental changes, and asserting its place at the top of the aquatic food web. If Mawsonia represented power through patience, Onchopristes was its opposite, a specialist forged by motion. Superficially similar to a modern sawfish, this creature could reach lengths of over 20 feet, and its most striking feature was the elongated rostrum lined with sharp, tooth-like denticles. It was a multi-purpose tool, not just for striking prey, but also for sensing vibrations, stirring the muddy riverbed to flush out hidden animals, and even parrying attacks. Paleontologists have found its rostral spines scattered widely across Cretaceous sediments, sometimes embedded in the bones of other animals. Each spine is a signature of its ecological importance, a clue to how it interacted not only with its prey, but with the wider community of the river system. Then there were the giant lungfish, survivors from a lineage that first appeared long before the dinosaurs. These remarkable creatures, some longer than a person is tall, were living bridges between worlds. Their ability to breathe both air and water allowed them to persist through droughts that might have wiped out other species. They could burrow into the riverbed and enter a state of suspended life until rains returned, reawakening when the floodplains filled again. This resilience made them a stabilizing force in a constantly changing environment. During wet seasons, they thrived as active predators and scavengers. During dry ones, they persisted as dormant seeds of future ecosystems, ready to repopulate once conditions improved. These aquatic giants were more than isolated curiosities. Their presence shaped everything around them, driving the evolution of predators and influencing the behavior of smaller species. The sheer size and abundance of fish like Mawsonia and Onchopristis created an enormous reservoir of energy within the food web, one that sustained crocodilians, reptiles, and even large theropods. Predators that could exploit this resource had an evolutionary advantage, and many evolved accordingly. The elongated snouts and specialized teeth of certain dinosaurs, the sensitive pressure-sensing organs of aquatic hunters, and even the stealth strategies of crocodilians all trace part of their evolutionary story to the presence of these fish. But evolution is never a one-way street. As predators adapted, so did the giants below. The heavy, plate-like scales of Mawsonia offered protection against bites, making it harder for attackers to penetrate. Onchopristis, with its agile swimming and formidable rostrum, could evade capture or even inflict injuries on would-be hunters. Lungfish, by shifting their life cycles in sync with seasonal changes, could vanish into the mud when conditions became dangerous, reappearing only when waters returned. Each adaptation by a predator was matched by a counter-adaptation from its prey, creating a slow, intricate evolutionary arms race that stretched over millions of years. The fossil record preserves glimpses of this dynamic world. In ancient river sediments, paleontologists have unearthed vertebrae the size of dinner plates, rostral spines scattered like teeth after a struggle, and fossilized bite marks etched into scales hardened over millennia. These are not just remnants of individual animals, but traces of a vast ecological machine evidence of how life in the rivers was shaped by tension and balance. Some fossil beds contain far more fish remains than dinosaur bones, a sign that these waters were overflowing with biomass. The rivers were not passive backdrops, but living systems, pulsing with energy and complexity beneath their surface. What happened below the waterline mattered profoundly to the world above it. The abundance of aquatic life influenced migration patterns, shaped predator behavior, and even altered the chemistry of the water through nutrient cycling. And when rivers shifted course or dried away, it was these fish, resilient, adaptive, and deeply woven into the ecosystem, that determined how life would recover and evolve. The rivers of the Cretaceous were kingdoms of more than dinosaurs. Beneath their calm surfaces, an ancient drama unfolded, one of adaptation and counter-adaptation, power and persistence. It was a story written in scales and fins, rather than teeth and claws, a story that sculpted the very structure of life in the water and beyond. Even millions of years after their disappearance, the bones of these giants still speak, telling of a hidden world that shaped evolution from below. The world of the Cretaceous rivers was not only a realm of giants lurking beneath the water or stalking along the muddy banks. Life filled every layer of this ecosystem, and the skies above were no exception. While the currents churned below and shadows waited along the shore, the air itself was alive with movement. High above the water's shimmering surface, wings stretched wider than the height of a grown human beat against the wind. They belonged to the pterosaurs, the ancient masters of flight, who turned the rivers into their hunting grounds. Among the most striking of these aerial hunters was Alanka, a pterosaur unlike any bird that has ever flown. Its wings stretched more than 15 feet from tip to tip, their thin, leathery membranes held aloft by elongated fingers. Fossils suggest that Alanka was built for soaring, not flapping. It used warm air currents rising from the heated landscape to glide effortlessly across vast distances, conserving energy as it patrolled the waterways below. Its long, slender beak was toothless, shaped almost like a pair of tongs, and perfect for plucking fish from just beneath the water's surface. Sharing the skies with Alanka was Coloborhynchus, another pterosaur adapted to a life spent hunting over rivers. While smaller than Alanka, it was no less specialized. Its jaws were lined with pointed teeth angled forward, a design that acted like a fishing spear. Coloborhynchus often hunted by skimming low over the water, its wings cutting through the air in long, graceful strokes. When it spotted movement below, it would dip its beak into the water with precise timing, snapping up fish in mid-flight without ever needing to land. The techniques these flying reptiles used were as varied as their forms. Some likely employed a method called surface skimming, in which they glided just above the water, dragging their lower jaws through the current to snatch unsuspecting prey. Others might have hovered briefly before plunging downward to grab a fish in a quick strike. Some species even waded along the shallows on foot, probing the mud for small aquatic animals. The diversity of hunting strategies mirrored the diversity of the rivers themselves, where countless opportunities awaited those who could master the air. The relationship between these pterosaurs and the river's aquatic life was complex and dynamic. Fossil evidence reveals just how deeply intertwined their fates were. In layers of ancient sediment, paleontologists have uncovered pterosaur bones in the same strata as fish remains, crocodilian teeth, and Spinosaurus fossils, suggesting that these creatures shared the same habitats and often crossed paths. Pterosaur droppings, known as coprolites, sometimes contain fish scales and small bones, providing direct evidence of their diet. In rare cases, Fish fossils have been found with puncture marks from pterosaur teeth, frozen moments of predation preserved in stone. This web of interactions shaped both predator and prey. The abundance of fish in the Cretaceous rivers provided a steady food supply, allowing pterosaur species to grow large and thrive. But the presence of aerial hunters also influenced the behavior of the fish themselves. Some species evolved schooling behaviors, gathering in tight groups near deeper waters where they were harder to reach. Others may have shifted their activity to different times of day, rising closer to the surface only when the skies were empty. The aerial hunters were not without their own dangers. The rivers below were filled with threats, and the boundary between air and water was not always a safe one. A misjudged dive or an extended glide too close to the surface could end with a crocodilian's jaws snapping shut or a Spinosaurus lunging upward from below. Fossil evidence suggests that some pterosaurs did not escape these encounters. Broken bones and tooth marks on fossilized wings hint at predators striking when the opportunity arose. Even the skies themselves were not without competition. Pterosaurs likely competed with each other for fishing territories, their interactions ranging from mid-air displays to aggressive skirmishes. Their dominance in this aerial realm speaks to their remarkable adaptations. Pterosaurs had hollow, lightweight bones that reduced their body mass without sacrificing strength, allowing them to remain airborne for long periods. They possessed large breast muscles and a keeled breastbone that anchored powerful flight muscles, giving them the endurance needed to travel along river systems that stretched for hundreds of miles. Their keen eyesight, sharper than that of most modern birds, allowed them to spot ripples or flashes of silver from high above. These traits made pterosaurs the perfect complement to the predators below. While Spinosaurus hunted beneath the surface and Sarcosuchus waited in ambush along the shore, Elanca, Coloborhynchus, and their kin patrolled the air. Together, they formed a multi-layered network of predators that ensured few creatures in the rivers escaped the grasp of tooth, claw, or wing. Each layer of the ecosystem influenced the others, and the aerial hunters were no exception. They were as vital to the balance of this world as the fish they hunted and the predators they evaded. For millions of years, these flying reptiles ruled the skies over the Cretaceous waterways. Their silhouettes would have been a common sight against the wide blue expanse, gliding silently as shadows rippled across the water below. And though their bones are rare and delicate, scattered in fragments across ancient rock, they speak of a world where the air above the rivers was as alive and contested as the depths beneath a place where evolution stretched its creativity to the skies, shaping creatures whose mastery of flight made them kings of the air. Along the riverbanks of the Cretaceous world, the water often appeared calm. Sunlight danced across the surface, reeds rustled gently in the wind, and herds of herbivores gathered to drink. Yet beneath that stillness, a far older story was unfolding, one written in patience and perfected over tens of millions of years. It was the story of the crocodilians, ancient predators whose greatest strength was not their speed or size, but the timeless strategies that allowed them to dominate river ecosystems longer than almost any other group of animals on Earth. These strategies were not invented by a single species like Sarcosuchus. They were the result of a lineage that had been refining the art of the ambush since long before the first dinosaurs evolved. Fossil evidence shows that crocodilian ancestors were already using stealth-based hunting methods more than 200 million years ago, and those methods changed little by the time they reached their Cretaceous peak. Each refinement was an evolutionary experiment tested by natural selection. Every anatomical feature, every behavioral instinct was a tool honed to exploit the opportunities that rivers provided. The first principle was patience. In the slow, meandering waterways of Cretaceous Africa, time was an ally to the hunter. Energy was precious, and crocodilians learned early that motionless waiting was more efficient than pursuit. Their bodies adapted to this strategy in subtle but powerful ways. A low, flattened posture allowed them to sink just below the surface, exposing only their eyes and nostrils. Specialized muscles let them remain nearly motionless for hours, conserving energy until the perfect moment. Even their metabolism evolved to sustain long periods of inactivity without weakening their strength. These were not impulsive predators. They were living traps, sculpted by evolution to outlast their prey's attention span. The second principle was invisibility. Crocodilians evolved skin that did more than protect them, it turned them into part of the landscape. Their ridged, irregular surfaces broke up their outline against floating vegetation and drifting debris. Their coloring, a blend of muted browns and greens, mirrored the muddy water and shaded banks. Even their sensory systems contributed to the illusion. Tiny pressure sensors along their jaws could detect the faintest vibrations, allowing them to track movements without breaking cover. This near-perfect camouflage ensured that most prey never realized danger was near until it was too late. The third principle was precision. When the moment to strike arrived, every muscle, bone, and tendon worked in concert. Evolution had shaped crocodilians into living catapults. Their tails, flattened into muscular paddles, could propel them forward with startling acceleration. Their jaws, lined with interlocking teeth, were not just weapons but traps, designed to grip and hold. And once the prey was secured, their entire bodies became tools of disassembly. The infamous death roll, a spinning maneuver that tears apart large victims, is thought to have evolved by this time, turning the river into a stage for brutal mechanical efficiency. These behaviors were not isolated acts of violence. They were the foundation of an evolutionary dialogue that stretched across ecosystems. Prey species, constantly under pressure, began to adapt in response. Fossil evidence suggests that many herbivorous dinosaurs developed longer necks, allowing them to drink from a distance without exposing their bodies to attack. Some evolved social strategies, approaching water in groups and forming protective circles around their young. Others altered their migration patterns, visiting rivers only during certain seasons when water levels offered safer conditions. Even fish, shaped by millions of years of predation, evolved faster reflexes and tighter schools to reduce the odds of capture. The crocodilians adapted in turn. Their sensory systems became more refined, their strikes more calculated. Evidence from fossilized riverbanks suggests they returned to the same crossing points year after year, likely learning where prey would gather and timing their hunts to seasonal migrations. Their intelligence, often underestimated, was part of the strategy. Modern crocodiles demonstrate memory, problem-solving, and even coordinated group hunting behaviors that likely have deep evolutionary roots stretching back to their Cretaceous ancestors. This long-running arms race between predator and prey had profound effects on the structure of the ecosystem itself. The presence of crocodilians influenced where animals drank, how they moved, and even how plants grew along the water's edge. Vegetation patterns were shaped by the behavior of herbivores that avoided dangerous areas, while nutrient cycles were altered by carcasses dragged into the water and consumed. The crocodilian way of life was not just about killing, it was about shaping the entire rhythm of the rivers. And across more than 80 million years, the same strategy continued to work. Modern crocodiles, though smaller than Sarcosuchus and its ancient kin, still rely on patience, stealth, and precision. They still learn where migrations occur. They still anticipate the movements of their prey. They still use the same evolutionary toolkit that their ancestors perfected in the Cretaceous. In a world where most species rise and fall, crocodilians are a rare constant proof that in nature, strategies that work can endure almost unchanged for geological ages. The rivers of the past were not just places of life and growth. They were also arenas of strategy and adaptation, where predator and prey shaped each other across deep time. And in the shallows, beneath the drifting reeds and the mirrored sky, the masters of ambush waited, silent and patient, as they always had and as they still do today. The rivers of the mid-Cretaceous were arteries of life, shaping every rhythm of the landscape and dictating the movements of those who depended on them. For herbivorous dinosaurs, these waterways were not just sources of water, but the guiding lines of their existence. They determined where herds traveled, when they gathered, and how they lived their days. They were roads, pantries, and gathering places all at once, and the lives of countless species unfolded along their banks. The story of those herbivores was one of constant motion. Many species did not remain in one place year-round, but instead followed the rivers as they ebbed and flowed with the seasons. Fossil trackways stretching for dozens of kilometers show parallel paths carved into ancient floodplain mud, traces of great migrations that returned year after year. These journeys were more than simple movements from one patch of vegetation to another. They were carefully timed responses to rainfall patterns, plant growth cycles, and the shifting geography of the waterways themselves. When the wet seasons swelled the rivers and brought lush vegetation to life, herds would follow the fresh growth upstream. As the water receded and floodplains dried, they would move on, always seeking the next reliable source of food and water. Iguanodonts were among the most common travelers along these ancient routes. They were sturdy, beaked herbivores that often moved in groups, their migrations likely spanning hundreds of kilometers in a single season. They grazed on low-lying vegetation along the riverbanks, stripping leaves and stems from young trees and shrubs. Their broad, hoof-like feet were well suited to soft, muddy ground, and their strong legs allowed them to travel long distances without tiring. Fossil evidence suggests that many iguanodont species synchronized their movements with the changing river systems, following predictable patterns year after year in a cycle that mirrored the climate itself. Larger herds of hadrosaurs also traced these paths. These duck-billed dinosaurs were highly social, traveling in numbers that offered protection and coordination. Their migrations were impressive spectacles, vast waves of animals moving across floodplains and through shallow river crossings. Fossilized trackways often capture these moments in remarkable detail. In one site, hundreds of hadrosaur footprints follow a single direction along an ancient watercourse, showing not just a herd on the move, but a disciplined, coordinated migration. The youngest individual's footprints are clustered near the center of the group, suggesting that the herd actively protected its most vulnerable members during their journeys. Behavior near the water's edge was shaped by countless generations of learned responses. Approaching a river was not a simple act of drinking, but a complex ritual built on caution and communication. The dominant individuals of a herd often approached first, scanning the surface for disturbances and listening for signs of movement. Some species may have used their tails to test the ground ahead, sensing vibrations that might hint at hidden dangers beneath the water. Fossilized trackways show moments of hesitation, with animals pausing and shifting direction before stepping forward. These subtle traces capture behavior frozen in time, a herd testing its surroundings before committing to the water. Social communication was vital in these moments. Herbivorous dinosaurs likely used a range of signals, low vocalizations, tail movements, or subtle changes in posture to coordinate their actions. Modern herd animals display similar behaviors, and the evidence from trackways suggests that their Mesozoic counterparts did the same. A ripple in the water might cause a sudden pause. A shared vocalization could trigger a retreat. Even the youngest animals would have understood these signals, their instincts shaped by generations of ancestral experience. Migration routes and daily routines also evolved around environmental patterns. Many herds timed their movements to coincide with dawn or dusk, when temperatures were cooler and water levels were often lower. Fossil evidence suggests that some species returned to the same drinking sites, season after season, creating deeply worn trails that remained visible in the sediment for thousands of years. Others shifted their movements entirely as rivers changed course, adapting to the new geography of the floodplains without hesitation. These behaviors were flexible but not random, reflecting a deep understanding of the rhythms of the landscape. Nesting behavior offers another glimpse into how deeply the rivers shaped herbivore lives. Paleontologists have discovered fossilized nests not far from ancient waterways, suggesting that some species deliberately built their nests close to water sources. The reasons for this were practical. Soft, moist soils were easier to dig into, and abundant plant life provided nesting material and food for hatchlings. The proximity also meant that young dinosaurs could access water soon after hatching, an essential advantage in a world where survival depended on mobility. Even young dinosaurs participated in these water-driven cycles. Hatchlings likely learned migration routes by following older individuals, imprinting the patterns of movement into their own behavior. Juveniles may have practiced social signals and group coordination from an early age, skills that would one day help them navigate the challenges of adulthood. Fossilized footprints show smaller tracks weaving between larger ones, evidence of this multi-generational movement woven into the fabric of the herd. All of these behaviors, from migration and communication to nesting and risk assessment, reveal a picture of herbivores as active participants in their environment, not passive victims of predation. They were creatures shaped by water as much as by fear, their lives organized around the opportunities and challenges that rivers presented. The waterways provided food, water, and fertile ground, but they also demanded planning, cooperation, and adaptability. For the herbivores of the Cretaceous, thriving in such a world meant more than simply surviving. It meant learning the language of the rivers themselves and living in harmony with their ever-changing flow. The ancient rivers of the Cretaceous were worlds of giants. Spinosaurus lurked beneath the surface, Sarcosuchus waded in the shallows, and herds of dinosaurs came cautiously to drink. But beneath the heavy footsteps and thunderous battles, a quieter story was unfolding. It was written not by the colossal predators or towering herbivores, but by the small, often overlooked creatures that stitched the ecosystem together. They were the architects of balance, shaping the flow of energy and the cycling of nutrients in ways that made life itself possible. Amphibians were among the most important of these silent workers. Descendants of some of Earth's earliest land animals, they thrived along the margins of the rivers. Fossil evidence reveals a surprising diversity of frogs and salamanders in the Cretaceous wetlands, ranging from species no larger than a human thumb to others nearly the length of a modern cat. They spent their lives moving between water and land, breeding in shallow pools and feeding in damp soil. In doing so, they acted as living bridges between two worlds, transferring energy from aquatic environments to terrestrial ones and back again. Tadpoles grazed on algae, helping to control blooms that could have choked the waterways. Adult amphibians devoured insects and small invertebrates, keeping their populations in check and passing that energy up the food chain when they themselves became prey. Turtles, too, played a vital role in these ecosystems. The rivers were home to a variety of species, from small, soft-shelled hunters to massive, slow-moving giants with shells longer than a human is tall. Some were fully aquatic, gliding through the water in search of fish or carrion. Others lived more amphibious lives, basking on sunlit sandbars before slipping into the current to feed on plants and small animals. Their diet made them key recyclers of nutrients. By consuming decaying matter, they helped break down organic material and return it to the environment, fertilizing the floodplains and sustaining plant life that in turn supported vast herds of herbivores. Their shells, often preserved as fossils in ancient sediments, are among the most common remains found in these ancient riverbeds, a testament to their abundance and importance. Among the smallest but most influential inhabitants were the tiny invertebrates that filled every corner of the river system. In the shallows, swarms of crustaceans and insect larvae filtered nutrients from the water. Worms tunneled through the sediment, aerating the soil and enriching it with organic matter. Snails scraped algae from rocks, recycling nutrients back into the food web. Though often invisible in the fossil record, their presence can be traced through the fine details preserved in ancient sediments. Layers rich in microscopic shells and exoskeleton fragments speak to their abundance, while traces of burrows reveal their constant activity beneath the riverbed. Predators depended on these small creatures more than they might have realized. Many of the fish that dominated the rivers fed on crustaceans and insect larvae, and those fish, in turn, sustained larger hunters like Spinosaurus and Sarcosuchus. Even terrestrial animals were connected to this chain. Amphibians and small reptiles provided meals for birds and pterosaurs, which were then preyed upon by larger theropods. Without the constant work of the smallest species, the towering giants of the Cretaceous rivers could not have survived. Amber, fossilized tree resin, offers a rare and intimate glimpse into the lives of these tiny builders. Droplets of resin that once dripped from riverside trees have preserved delicate ecosystems in exquisite detail. Inside, scientists have found ancient insects frozen mid-flight, tiny spiders trapped in webs, and grains of pollen still clinging to their legs. These microcosms reveal the complexity of the food web at its smallest scales. Insects pollinated flowering plants, which spread across the floodplains and provided food for herbivores. Those insects also served as prey for amphibians and small reptiles, which in turn fed larger predators. Every level of the ecosystem, from the microscopic to the gigantic, was connected. Microfossils, too, shed light on this hidden world. Layers of river sediment contain countless remains, invisible to the naked eye. Spores from ancient ferns, diatoms that once floated in the water, and tiny crustacean shells no larger than grains of sand. These remnants record the pulse of life in the rivers with remarkable precision, showing how ecosystems responded to changes in climate, water flow, and nutrient availability. They reveal how sudden floods brought bursts of productivity, how dry seasons thinned populations, and how life adapted again and again to a shifting world. The impact of these small creatures extended beyond their immediate surroundings. Their constant activity helped maintain the health of the rivers themselves. By filtering water, recycling nutrients, and aerating sediments, they kept the ecosystem stable and resilient. When they thrived, so did everything else. When their populations declined, The entire system felt the effects. In the grand story of the Cretaceous rivers, it is easy to focus on the monsters that dominated the scene. But it was the quiet labor of amphibians, turtles, insects, and other small creatures that made that world possible. They laid the foundation upon which everything else was built, forming a vast, interconnected web of life that stretched from the muddy riverbed to the skies above. And though their bones are small and their fossils rare, their legacy endures in every ripple of water, every layer of sediment, and every towering predator that once depended on their unseen work. The rivers of the mid-Cretaceous were not just places where life gathered. They were crucibles where nature's most ambitious ideas were tested. In the slow swirl of water against the banks, in the damp soils of floodplains, and the shifting channels of ancient waterways, evolution became daring. It explored new ways to move, to feed, and to live. Here, the familiar boundaries between land and water dissolved, and a remarkable array of creatures began to blur them. Living near water brought undeniable rewards. The rivers offered abundance, steady supplies of prey, vegetation that flourished in fertile soil, and a cooler, more stable climate than the open plains. But they also presented new challenges. Animals shaped for running had to learn how to wade. Skeletons designed for dry ground had to adapt to buoyancy and drag. Eyes built for clear air had to make sense of murky light filtering through sediment-laden water. Over millions of years, these pressures rewrote anatomy and behavior in subtle but profound ways. Some of the most intriguing signs of this transformation appear in the fossil record of smaller theropods that lived along the water's edge. Their bones show unexpected density, a trait that would have reduced buoyancy and allowed them to stay submerged while stalking prey below the surface. In a few species, leg proportions shifted too. Shorter, stronger limbs hint at animals that spent time wading through shallow channels rather than sprinting across dry ground. These were not full-time swimmers but part-time pioneers, testing the possibilities of a semi-aquatic lifestyle. Herbivores, too, adapted in surprising ways. Some iguanodonts and their descendants developed broad, flattened feet that spread their weight more evenly on soft, muddy riverbanks. Fossilized trackways suggest that they sometimes waded into shallows to feed on water plants, a behavior that expanded their foraging range and reduced competition. A few early hadrosaurs even show hints of muscular tails that may have provided propulsion in deeper water, suggesting that they were becoming comfortable in environments where walking and swimming blended together. Among predators, experimentation took even more varied forms. Some small to medium-sized theropods evolved elongated skulls and narrow jaws suited for catching fish, their teeth less serrated and more conical, optimized for gripping rather than tearing. Chemical signatures, preserved in their fossilized bones, reveal diets heavily reliant on aquatic prey, evidence that they spent significant time near rivers and wetlands. These species were not entirely aquatic, but they were no longer strictly terrestrial either. They occupied a transitional space, exploiting food sources that their land-bound cousins ignored. Beyond dinosaurs, the rivers became theaters of innovation for many other groups. Crocodiliforms diversified into a stunning range of forms. Some became streamlined hunters with elongated snouts and paddle-like tails, perfect for fast movement through water. Others developed longer legs and more upright postures, allowing them to pursue prey farther inland before returning to the safety of the water. Even within a single lineage, evolutionary experiments diverged in multiple directions, showing how a single environment could produce a mosaic of solutions. Amphibians, already tied to watery habitats, continued to diversify. Some species grew larger and more robust, becoming powerful ambush predators in the shallows. Turtles adapted to exploit both land and water, their shells and limbs fine-tuned for swimming, yet still capable of supporting them on land. Early mammals, small and often nocturnal, ventured into wetlands to feed on aquatic insects or fish, their semi-aquatic habits a glimpse of the evolutionary paths that would later lead to otters, beavers, and even whales. The influence of rivers on evolution was not confined to the Cretaceous. They had shaped life's trajectory for hundreds of millions of years before. It was along the banks of ancient streams that the first vertebrates ventured from water onto land, their fins slowly becoming limbs. It was in the shifting delta systems of the Paleozoic that amphibians gave rise to reptiles and early synapsids. The same pressures that once encouraged fish to breathe air were still at work in the Cretaceous, now nudging terrestrial creatures back toward the water in search of opportunity. What made rivers such powerful engines of innovation was their restlessness. They never stayed the same. They swelled and shrank with the seasons, carved new channels across floodplains, and created a patchwork of environments, from stagnant backwaters to fast-flowing torrents. This constant change meant that animals living near them faced shifting challenges and opportunities. Flexibility became an advantage. Those that could adapt thrived. Those that could not vanished, leaving behind only traces of their short-lived experiments in the fossil record. Some of these evolutionary ventures would prove fleeting, lasting only a few million years before disappearing. Others laid the groundwork for future success, shaping lineages that would endure long after the rivers themselves had dried. The story written in the bones of these creatures is one of exploration without a map, of nature probing the edges of possibility. The rivers were not just habitats, they were testing grounds, pushing life to reinvent itself in ways that no static landscape ever could. And as the waters shifted and meandered across the ancient continents, so too did evolution, weaving new forms and strategies into the living fabric of the Cretaceous world. Some walked, some swam, and some did both, each shaped by the same force, the unceasing motion of water and the endless creativity it demanded from life. The rivers of the Cretaceous were more than winding threads of water across the land. They were vast record keepers, chroniclers of a world long vanished. As they rose and fell with the seasons, carrying silt from distant highlands and scattering it across floodplains, they built something far greater than landscapes. They built archives, layer upon layer, year after year. They pressed the passing of time into the earth, storing the stories of vanished ecosystems in a language written not with words, but with stone, bone, and dust. The fossil record that formed along these rivers is not simply a list of ancient creatures. It is a living timeline, one that preserves the rhythm of seasons, the pulse of evolution, and the fingerprints of catastrophe. In many places, paleontologists read it like a book that was written grain by grain. A dark band of fine silt may speak of a gentle flood that once blanketed a fertile plain. A thick layer of coarse sand might record a violent storm that tore through the landscape and swept everything in its path downstream. Each variation marks a moment, and together they form a continuous record stretching across millions of years. Some of the most dramatic pages in this story are the bone beds, dense layers where the remains of life accumulated in great abundance. These deposits often formed during moments of crisis. During long droughts, herds of herbivores might have crowded around shrinking pools, their bodies ultimately buried together when a sudden flood swept over the desiccated plain. In other places, colossal storms may have surged across the landscape, drowning fish, turtles, and even dinosaurs, and depositing their remains in deep, quiet channels. Within these layers, bones from different species often lie intertwined, preserving a single instant when an entire ecosystem was overwhelmed. Other layers capture the subtler rhythms of time. Some river deposits show repeating bands of sediment that record the annual cycle of wet and dry seasons, a natural calendar etched into the earth. Within those layers, fossilized pollen and plant fragments trace changes in vegetation over thousands of years, revealing shifts in climate as forests gave way to grasslands or wetlands dried into scrub. Chemical signatures within fossilized bones add another dimension to this record, showing how animals migrated with the seasons, following the rivers' shifting courses as water and food supplies changed. Even microscopic traces can carry profound messages. Grains of volcanic ash embedded within a floodplain deposit reveal moments when distant eruptions cloaked the skies and altered the global climate. Thin layers of marine sediment tell of times when sea levels rose, allowing saltwater to surge deep inland. At other points in the record, a sudden disappearance of certain pollen types or the abrupt appearance of new ones signals a rapid shift in temperature or rainfall. These minute details offer a level of resolution that allows scientists to reconstruct not only what lived in a place, but how that place changed year by year and epoch by epoch. Extinction itself is also written in these layers. In some sites, a rich diversity of fossils gives way suddenly to a sparse scattering of bones or none at all. Entire groups vanish from the record, replaced by new forms that appear higher in the sediment. These transitions can mark sudden disasters, such as prolonged droughts or rapid climate shifts, but they also capture the slower workings of evolution. Over millions of years, species recorded in the lower layers may transform gradually, their bones shifting in shape and size as they adapt to new conditions. Each small change is a step in a story that stretches far beyond the lifespan of any single creature. The fossil record preserves not only life and death, but also behavior. In certain floodplain deposits, paleontologists have uncovered fossilized trackways layered one atop another, evidence that herds followed the same migration routes for generations. Some layers preserve the delicate impressions of nests and eggs, showing where dinosaurs returned season after season to raise their young. In others, the bones of prey species bear deep gouges from predator teeth, silent traces of ancient hunts. Even ripple marks in ancient mud and the polygonal patterns of dried lake beds are preserved, recording the rise and fall of water long vanished from the surface. Amber and microfossils add even more depth to this record. Tiny bubbles of resin capture pollen grains, insect wings, and fragments of ancient plants, offering a snapshot of the smallest components of the ecosystem. These details provide a richer understanding of how climate and environment shaped life on every scale. From towering dinosaurs to microscopic algae drifting in the water, all of these clues combine into a powerful narrative machine, one that allows scientists to travel backward through time. A single cross-section of ancient floodplain rock can reveal the rise of a new species, the collapse of an old ecosystem, the arrival of a drought, or the aftermath of a storm. It can show how landscapes shifted, how life adapted, and how entire worlds ended and began again. Each layer is a page in a story that never truly stops being written, a record of water's patient work, turning moments into memory and memory into stone. The rivers of the Cretaceous were never peaceful kingdoms ruled by a single apex hunter. They were battlegrounds where power was constantly tested, where strength alone did not guarantee survival. Life at the top was an uneasy balance, shaped by rivalry and sharpened by the presence of competitors. Every creature that rose to dominance did so under pressure from another equally formidable force, and every adaptation was measured against the demands of coexistence and conflict. In this ancient arena, the waterways themselves shaped the rules of engagement. Deep channels, muddy banks, and shifting currents created different hunting grounds, each with its own challenges and rewards. Over time, predators adapted to occupy specific territories and strategies, a process scientists call niche partitioning. By dividing the environment among themselves, they reduced direct competition, but they never eliminated it. Whenever those territories overlapped, the rivers could become violent places. One of the most powerful players in this struggle was Spinosaurus, a predator whose lifestyle was unlike any other dinosaur. It dominated the deeper channels, where its streamlined tail and conical teeth allowed it to pursue and capture the enormous fish that thrived there. Yet its reign was challenged by Sarcosuchus, the colossal crocodilian that ruled the shallows. Sarcosuchus relied on patience rather than speed, lurking near the riverbanks until an unsuspecting victim stepped within reach. Its skull, packed with more than 100 teeth, was a weapon designed for crushing through bone and armor alike. Where Spinosaurus excelled in the chase, Sarcosuchus ruled the ambush. For most of the time, these giants avoided each other, their hunting methods and territories reducing the likelihood of encounters. But rivers are dynamic landscapes, and their boundaries shifted constantly. During periods of drought, water levels dropped, pushing aquatic prey into smaller, crowded spaces and forcing predators into closer proximity. Flood seasons could bring new channels and feeding grounds, blurring the invisible borders between domains. In those moments, direct confrontations were inevitable. Fossil evidence hints at these clashes. Deep puncture marks on dinosaur bones, matching the shape of Sarcosuchus's conical teeth, suggest attacks on large theropods that ventured too close to the shore. Likewise, crocodilian fossils bearing gouges from sharp claws may record moments when a predator fought back. These scars are more than traces of violence. They are signatures of competition, evidence that even apex hunters risked becoming prey themselves when territories overlapped. And the battles were not limited to these two titans. The rivers were home to a complex hierarchy of predators, each influencing the others in subtle ways. Enormous sawfish like Onchopristis, though primarily prey for larger animals, competed directly for smaller fish and disrupted hunting strategies by slashing through schools with their serrated snouts. Massive predatory fish, some more than 6 meters long, could overwhelm smaller dinosaurs that entered deeper waters, forcing them to adapt their hunting behavior. Even pterosaurs, diving from above to snatch prey, added pressure from the skies, intercepting food before larger predators could claim it. The result was a web of overlapping roles, each predator shaping and responding to the presence of the others. This constant competition left its mark on evolution. The streamlined body and muscular tail of Spinosaurus may have been honed not only for chasing prey, but also for outmaneuvering aquatic rivals. The immense bite force of Sarcosuchus, capable of splintering bone, was likely reinforced by generations of conflict, ensuring it could defend its territory against larger dinosaurs, predators that could adapt to shifting conditions to new prey, new water levels, or new competitors thrived. Those that could not faded into the fossil record, their evolutionary experiments cut short by the relentless pressure of rivalry. The effects of this competition rippled outward, shaping the behavior and evolution of other species as well. Herbivorous dinosaurs faced layered dangers, where the wrong step could bring an ambush from the shallows or a pursuit from the depths. Smaller predators, too, were forced to specialize, adopting nocturnal habits, forming packs, or shifting their diets to avoid direct competition with larger hunters. The ecosystem became a living chessboard, every move by one species prompting a countermove by another. Even the rivers themselves became part of this evolutionary arms race. Changing water levels, shifting currents, and seasonal cycles created conditions that constantly rewrote the rules of competition. A drought could strip one predator of its advantage, while a flood could open new hunting grounds to another. Over millions of years, these pressures sculpted creatures into finely tuned specialists, each uniquely adapted to claim a piece of the contested domain. What emerges from the fossil record is a portrait of life at the top that is far more complex than simple dominance. The apex predators of the Cretaceous rivers did not exist in isolation. They were shaped by one another, defined by their rivals, and forced into innovation by the constant threat of displacement. Every scarred bone and every evolved adaptation tells the story of that struggle, a relentless contest where no throne was permanent and every reign was challenged. It was a world where the most dangerous enemy was often not the prey struggling to escape, but the competitor lurking just beyond sight. And in that hidden conflict, fought silently beneath the surface and in sudden bursts of violence, the course of evolution itself was forged. For millions of years, the rivers of the Cretaceous had been the heartbeat of the land, pulsing with regular floods and rains that seemed eternal. Their waters rose and fell with the seasons, their banks greened with life, and their currents carried the rhythms that shaped entire ecosystems. Yet even the most reliable patterns of nature are never fixed. Deep beneath the surface of stability, the climate is always shifting, driven by slow changes in the planet's orbit, the chemistry of the atmosphere, and the movements of continents themselves. It was in one of these slow, hidden shifts that the first cracks in the river world began to appear. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The rain still came, the monsoons still swept inland from the sea, and the rivers still spilled over their banks each year. But subtle changes crept into the cycle. The storms that had once arrived like clockwork began to falter. Some years they came early and raged with unusual force, drowning floodplains under churning brown water and stripping vegetation from the banks. Other years they barely came at all, leaving behind dust where streams had once danced and exposing sandbars that had never seen the sun. The once steady pulse of the hydrological system began to stutter. These changes left unmistakable marks in the geologic record. In places where sediments once showed a predictable pattern of water-laid layers, geologists now find alternating bands of flood deposits and wind-blown dust. Fossil soils from this time bear the fine, polygonal cracks that form when mud dries too quickly under a scorching sun. In some regions, broad river channels suddenly end in abrupt wedges of sand, a sign that the flow had weakened or shifted entirely. Even ancient pollen, trapped and preserved in those sediments, tells the same story. Water-loving plants gave way to hardier shrubs and deep-rooted trees, better suited to uncertain rainfall. These were not signs of collapse, not yet. The rivers still flowed, and the landscapes they shaped still supported life. But the stability that had once defined them was fading. Streams that once meandered gently across wide plains now cut narrower, deeper channels as water levels fluctuated more dramatically. Tributaries that had fed the main rivers with predictable regularity dried up without warning, leaving behind empty gullies and isolated ponds. Oxbow lakes, once refuges of biodiversity, became seasonal features, filling during wet years and shrinking to cracked basins during dry ones. The first to feel the strain were the smallest and most sensitive organisms, Aquatic invertebrates, which relied on stable water conditions to reproduce, saw their populations fluctuate wildly. Microscopic algae, once abundant in the slow-moving channels, vanished during dry spells, only to bloom explosively when the rains returned. These boom and bust cycles rippled upward through the food web. Fish that had once thrived in interconnected waterways found themselves stranded in shrinking pools, forced to adapt to new conditions or perish. Some evolved new behaviors, laying eggs in deeper waters or migrating with the changing seasons. Others disappeared entirely, leaving only faint traces in the fossil record. Larger animals soon felt the effects too, though in ways that were less dramatic and more drawn out. Herbivorous dinosaurs, which had long followed predictable seasonal migrations, began to shift their routes, wandering farther in search of water and vegetation. Trackways from this period show herds moving in less direct paths, circling back on themselves, as if searching for familiar watering grounds that no longer existed. Predators followed them, but their own patterns changed as prey became harder to find. Fossil evidence suggests that some carnivores expanded their ranges, while others began scavenging more frequently, exploiting carcasses left behind by animals that failed to survive the harsher conditions. Even the rivers themselves seemed to struggle under the new regime. Channels that had once supported lush floodplain forests now bordered stands of drought-tolerant plants. Some wetlands became choked with silt as irregular floods deposited sediment in unpredictable bursts. Other areas dried so thoroughly that wind scoured the former riverbeds, erasing traces of water altogether. The once unbroken corridors of riparian life began to fragment into a patchwork of habitats, some thriving, others fading. The signs of stress appeared in the bones as well as the landscape. Fossilized remains from this time often show signs of malnutrition, thinner growth rings in bones, suggesting shorter growing seasons and fewer juveniles, hinting at reproductive challenges. In some places, species diversity dropped, not in a single catastrophic wave, but in a slow decline as specialized creatures disappeared and only the most adaptable endured. Yet, even as these warning signs accumulated, the full weight of what was coming remained hidden. To an animal living then, the rivers still seemed vast, the forests still green, and the rains still dependable only slightly less so than before. But deep time would reveal the truth. These subtle shifts were not random fluctuations. They were the first tremors of a larger transformation, signals that the age of abundance was beginning to fray at the edges. The water still flowed, but its rhythms were no longer steady, and in those small irregularities lay the seeds of a future that would change the rivers and the lives that depended on them forever. The decline of the great Cretaceous rivers was not a single, dramatic event. It unfolded gradually, a slow tightening of the world that pushed every living thing toward the limits of what it could endure. As rainfall grew less reliable and waterways began to fragment, the once connected veins of water that had shaped life for millions of years became scattered and unpredictable. Pools that had once swelled with abundance now vanished for seasons at a time. Streams that had cut wide, fertile valleys narrowed into thin ribbons of mud. In this harsher landscape, survival was no longer a matter of strength or size. It became a question of adaptability. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalog of those who changed and those who could not. It shows how life twisted itself into new shapes, invented new strategies, and rewrote the rules of existence in order to survive. Among the first to respond were the fish, the heartbeat of the river ecosystem. Some species adapted by changing their physiology to match the shifting environment. Fossil evidence of gill structure in certain bony fish suggests they evolved to extract oxygen more efficiently from warm, stagnant waters that once would have suffocated them. Others grew more tolerant of fluctuations in salinity as isolated pools alternated between fresh and brackish. A few developed astonishing strategies for survival during dry seasons. Lungfish, for example, retreated into the mud, encasing themselves in a protective cocoon and breathing air through specialized organs until the rains returned. These same adaptations, still seen in their modern descendants, are a direct legacy of the environmental pressures first felt during this time. Crocodilians, too, left traces of their evolutionary adjustments in the fossil record. Species that had once relied on deep, permanent channels began to develop stronger limbs and lighter bodies, traits that made them more mobile in shallow or temporary waterways. Some altered their nesting habits, moving their eggs farther from the water's edge to escape the risk of sudden floods during erratic storms. Variations in skull shape and jaw mechanics reveal changing diets, as some shifted from large prey to smaller, more abundant fish, turtles, or even carrion. These subtle transformations helped them maintain their dominance even as their habitats changed beyond recognition. For herbivorous dinosaurs, adaptation often took the form of movement and endurance. As vegetation along riverbanks became patchier, hadrosaurs and iguanodonts traveled farther than before, following ancient watercourses across vast distances in search of reliable food and water. Tracks preserved in fossilized mud show long, looping routes rather than the short seasonal migrations of earlier times. Some herbivores evolved more efficient digestive systems, able to extract nutrients from tougher, drier plants that had replaced the lush greenery of wetter periods. Others shifted their feeding strategies entirely, browsing higher in the canopy or foraging among hardy shrubs that could survive the drier conditions. The smallest inhabitants of these ecosystems often proved the most inventive. Amphibians, once reliant on permanent pools for reproduction, began breeding rapidly during short wet seasons, their entire life cycles compressed into narrow windows of opportunity. Fossilized burrows reveal that many species survived dry months hidden beneath the ground, their bodies slowing into a state of suspended animation until the return of water. Turtles evolved thicker shells that conserved moisture and protected them from the intense heat, while insects adjusted their life cycles to synchronize with unpredictable rains, emerging only when conditions were right for reproduction and growth. Not all responses were successful. Many species failed to adapt quickly enough and vanished from the fossil record altogether. Whole lineages of fish disappear from the sediments after this period, their inability to cope with fluctuating water levels sealing their fate. Certain crocodilian species, once widespread, are known only from a handful of fossils before they vanish entirely. Even some herbivorous dinosaurs that had been common for millions of years left no descendants, their evolutionary experiments cut short by the unforgiving pressures of change. The shifting environment also rearranged the structure of the food web. With large predators declining in number, smaller carnivores expanded into niches that had once been beyond their reach. In the remnants of once mighty river systems, ecosystems reorganized into smaller, more self-contained communities. Wetlands that had once supported vast networks of species now hosted simpler webs dominated by generalists, animals capable of surviving on a wide variety of foods and tolerating a range of conditions. Fossil isotopes and bone chemistry from this period provide further evidence of these adjustments. They show changes in diet and habitat use across multiple species, from herbivores that began browsing in new plant zones to predators that turned opportunistic as prey grew scarce. Even the distribution of plant pollen shifts dramatically in the geological record, reflecting the rise of species that could withstand longer dry seasons and the decline of those dependent on constant moisture. The story preserved in these layers of rock is not one of sudden collapse, but of relentless adaptation. It shows how life bends rather than breaks, how it searches for new paths when old ones close. Some of the species that navigated these pressures left descendants that still swim in rivers, bask on muddy banks, or migrate across floodplains today. Others vanished, their brief evolutionary experiments buried beneath the sediments of time. But together, they reveal a single, unbroken thread. In a changing world, survival belongs to those who can change with it. For millions of years, the rivers of Cretaceous Africa had been the arteries of a thriving world. They shaped valleys, fed forests, and stitched together ecosystems that depended on their endless movement. But nothing in nature lasts forever. The same forces that had once built these waterways were now conspiring to erase them. What began as subtle seasonal shifts long before had, by this point, hardened into a relentless transformation. The era of flowing rivers was drawing to a close. The signs of this final chapter are written not in the stories of living creatures, but in the rocks beneath our feet. Sediment layers that once told of overflowing banks and fertile floodplains suddenly change character. Fine-grained deposits left by steady water flow are abruptly replaced by heavy, mineral-rich bands of gypsum and halite. These evaporite layers, found deep beneath the modern Sahara, form only when standing water vanishes and leaves its dissolved salts behind. They are geological signatures of rivers evaporating under an unforgiving sky. Other traces show how the land itself responded as water disappeared. Ancient channels, once carved deep by rushing currents, filled slowly with wind-blown sand. Dunes advanced over former floodplains, their gentle ripples erasing the evidence of moving water. Cross-bedded layers within these sands, still visible in exposed cliffs today, preserve the shape of ancient desert winds, their shifting directions marking a landscape no longer shaped by rivers but by air. Ripple marks etched into hardened sediments trace the final trickles of streams that dried mid-flow, their patterns frozen in time. Even the shape of the land bears witness to the collapse. River valleys that once stretched across northern Africa now terminate abruptly, their courses ending in dry basins rather than flowing to the sea. These basins, once fertile lakes, hardened into vast salt flats before being buried beneath younger layers of sediment. Oxbow lakes, once calm sanctuaries teeming with life, became depressions filled with evaporite crusts and wind-blown dust. The landscape, once animated by water, settled into stillness. This environmental transformation did not happen in a single season or century. It unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, but its effects were profound and final. The aquatic world that had flourished for so long began to vanish in waves. Fossil layers record the steady disappearance of fish species, their remains growing rarer and smaller before ceasing altogether. The bones of crocodilians become less frequent, then absent, as shrinking rivers left them without hunting grounds. Even the traces of river-dwelling invertebrates, once abundant in the sediments, disappear from the record as water bodies dried beyond recovery. The collapse left scars on the wider ecosystem as well. Floodplain forests that had depended on regular inundation shrank and died back. Layers once rich in fossilized wood and leaf impressions give way to barren sandstones, signaling the retreat of plant life that could not survive without consistent water. Herbivorous dinosaurs, which had followed the river's courses for generations, left fewer footprints and fewer bones behind. In some places, fossil trackways stop abruptly at the edge of now vanished watercourses, as if entire herds had simply ceased their migrations. The geological evidence even captures moments of desperation in this fading world. In some bone beds, paleontologists have uncovered dense accumulations of animal remains concentrated in what were once isolated waterholes. These deposits speak of drought so severe that entire populations converged on the last surviving pools, only for many to perish there when the water finally vanished. Elsewhere, layers of windblown dust lie directly atop aquatic sediments, showing how abruptly the transformation could occur when evaporation outpaced rainfall entirely. By the final stages of this drying, the once vast river network had fractured into isolated fragments. Scattered wetlands remained as brief seasonal oases, filling with rain only to evaporate weeks or months later. These ephemeral pockets of water supported small, temporary ecosystems, but they were ghosts of what had existed before. Eventually, even these vanished, leaving behind nothing but mineral crusts and shifting sand. Today, satellite imagery reveals the outlines of those lost rivers beneath the Sahara's surface. Faint, branching scars stretch for hundreds of kilometers, buried beneath layers of wind-deposited sediment. Ground-penetrating radar confirms that many of these channels are filled with ancient sands, their original courses preserved like veins in stone. In some places, cores drilled deep into the desert reveal layers of freshwater mud and fossilized pollen sealed beneath dunes, the final echoes of a world that once pulsed with water. The end of the rivers did not arrive with a sudden cataclysm, but with a long, quiet withdrawal. Water receded step by step, leaving behind evaporite crusts, wind-shaped dunes, and the fossilized remnants of a lost ecosystem. Each geological layer from this time is a record of that retreat, marking the stages of a transformation that turned a lush, water-bound landscape into one of the most arid places on Earth. Beneath the Sahara's endless sands, those records remain, silent witnesses to the great drying that once reshaped a continent and erased one of the most extraordinary freshwater worlds the planet has ever known. When the last of the Cretaceous rivers finally gave way to drought and silence, the transformation of northern Africa was far from over. The disappearance of water was not the end of the story, but the beginning of another, slower and more relentless chapter. Over millions of years, the forces that shape continents continued their patient work. Wind replaced water as the main sculptor of the land. Erosion carved new forms where rivers once flowed, and layer by layer, grain by grain, the memory of a thriving world was buried beneath the sands. It is difficult to imagine the Sahara as anything but a desert. Today, it stretches over 3 million square miles, a sea of dunes and barren plateaus that covers most of northern Africa. But this immense landscape is not the result of a single event. It was built over millions of years by some of the most subtle yet powerful forces on Earth. Once the great rivers had dried and vegetation vanished, the land was left exposed to wind and weather. Without forests or wetlands to anchor the soil, sediments that had settled on ancient floodplains became vulnerable. Dust and sand, once trapped by roots and moisture, were now free to move. Wind became the new river, carrying grains of sand across the landscape in slow, steady waves. Over time, these grains gathered into dunes, some rising hundreds of feet high and stretching for miles. They advanced across the land like a tide, swallowing everything in their path. Entire riverbeds were smothered, their channels filled, and their curves erased. Oxbow lakes, once home to fish and amphibians, vanished beneath thick blankets of sand. Fossilized tree trunks, remnants of lush floodplain forests, were buried so deeply that their existence would not be known for millions of years. Erosion worked hand in hand with the wind. Seasonal storms and rare rains carved away the soft sediments left by ancient rivers, reshaping the landscape into mesas, buttes, and escarpments. Over time, vast basins deepened where floodplains had once stretched unbroken and rocky plateaus replaced fertile deltas. In some areas, the wind polished exposed rock into smooth, glassy surfaces known as desert pavement. In others, it carved the land into sweeping dunes that migrated slowly across the horizon, shifting shape with every passing season. The process was gradual but relentless. What water had once built over millions of years, the wind dismantled grain by grain. Even the fossil record itself became obscured. Bones that had once been buried in rich, water-laid sediments were now scattered or exposed to the elements, their stories fragmented. Some were ground into dust by wind-blown sand. Others were buried so deeply that they would remain hidden until modern science uncovered them. The once vibrant ecosystem, with its crocodile-filled rivers and colossal predators, was sealed away beneath a barren expanse. Yet the memory of water never vanished entirely. In some places, the ghostly outlines of ancient channels still remain, etched faintly into the rock beneath the desert. Geologists using satellite imagery have traced networks of buried river systems stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the Sahara's surface. These hidden pathways reveal the scale of what once existed, showing where rivers meandered, split, and rejoined long before the desert took hold. In a few rare spots, erosion has peeled back the layers of sand to reveal fossil-rich deposits, fragments of crocodile skulls, fish scales, and dinosaur bones preserved from a time when this place was anything but empty. The desert itself tells a story written not in water but in wind. Its vast dunes march across the landscape like waves frozen in time, shaped by currents of air that sweep across the continent. Dust lifted from the Sahara travels thousands of miles across oceans, fertilizing forests in South America and seeding marine life in the Atlantic. In this way, even the silence of the desert is part of a larger system, a continuation of the forces that once made rivers flow and ecosystems flourish. Over tens of millions of years, the transformation was complete. The world that had once been lush and alive was now entombed beneath shifting sands. The rivers, the floodplains, and the forests were gone, replaced by a landscape that seemed eternal and unchanging. To the untrained eye, there is little to suggest that anything different ever existed here. Yet deep beneath the dunes, the earth remembers. Each layer of sand, each grain of dust, is part of a vast archive, recording the rise and fall of climates and the changing face of continents. The Sahara as we know it today is not a relic of the past, but a monument to the passage of time. It is the end result of countless transformations, shaped by forces that operate too slowly for human eyes to witness. Beneath its surface lies a hidden world, sealed away by wind and erosion, waiting for the rare moments when science peels back the layers to glimpse what once was. What was once a vibrant kingdom of rivers and life is now a vast, silent sea of sand. The world did not disappear in an instant. It was buried alive, sealed beneath the weight of time, preserved in a desert that still whispers of water long vanished. The earth moved on, as it always does, carrying the memory of that lost world deep within its shifting skin. For tens of millions of years, the memory of the rivers that once pulsed beneath the Sahara lay sealed beneath its shifting dunes. Where water had once carved valleys and nourished forests, there was now only silence, a vast expanse of wind-shaped sand that seemed eternal. Yet beneath that surface, the earth still held its secrets. Ancient riverbeds still wound invisibly through the bedrock. Fossilized bones still slept where floodplains once teemed with life. And in recent decades, humanity has learned how to listen to those buried stories with tools far more powerful than pickaxes and shovels. The rediscovery of this hidden world did not begin in the field, but from the sky. As satellite technology advanced in the late 20th century, scientists gained the ability to scan the desert's surface in wavelengths beyond human sight. Using radar and multispectral imaging, they began to trace faint patterns beneath the dunes, ghostly channels branching like veins beneath the sand, twisting and converging across hundreds of miles. These were paleochannels, the fossilized courses of rivers that had dried tens of millions of years ago. Some were wide and braided, the marks of ancient floods that once carried sediment across vast floodplains. Others were narrow and deeply incised, evidence of rivers that had cut through bedrock over thousands of seasons. Together they revealed a landscape that had once been laced with water, connecting inland seas, wetlands, and distant deltas into one enormous, living system. Ground-penetrating radar deepened the picture. By sending radio pulses into the subsurface and recording their echoes, researchers could see not only the outlines of ancient rivers, but the fine details of their structure. Some scans revealed oxbow lakes still preserved beneath layers of sediment, their looping shapes perfectly intact. Others showed buried levees, point bars, and abandoned channels, frozen snapshots of rivers as they shifted and evolved over time. These discoveries allowed scientists to reconstruct the three-dimensional shape of the lost waterways with remarkable precision, showing how they meandered, branched, and sometimes abruptly vanished as the climate changed. Mapping alone, however, could not bring this vanished world fully into focus. To understand what had lived beside these rivers, paleontologists began targeting the sites where radar and satellite data indicated ancient floodplains and sediment traps. In remote corners of the Sahara, teams uncovered layers of rock that had not seen daylight in over 100 million years. In them lay the remains of ecosystems long erased from the surface. Fossilized fish vertebrae, some as large as a human hand, spoke of immense predators that once patrolled the channels. Crocodiliform skulls with deep-set teeth and massive jaws hinted at ambush hunters that had lurked in the shallows. Even the delicate traces of ferns and cycads, preserved as impressions in fine-grained mudstone, revealed the lush vegetation that had once fringed the water's edge. The discoveries did not stop with visible fossils. Using geochemical techniques, scientists began extracting information from the rocks themselves. Oxygen isotope ratios preserved in fossil bone revealed patterns of seasonal rainfall and evaporation, painting a picture of shifting monsoons over millions of years. Carbon isotopes from ancient soils tracked the transformation of plant life as wetlands dried and grasslands spread. Even trace elements in river sediments spoke of distant volcanic eruptions, ancient droughts, and the slow drift of continents that had reshaped rainfall patterns across the land. With these tools, researchers could do more than catalog fossils. They could reconstruct the behavior of ancient ecosystems. Digital models built from satellite data now simulate the flow of vanished rivers, showing how monsoon rains might have filled them each year and how sediment carried by those waters shaped the land. By layering isotopic climate data over these models, scientists can watch the rivers wax and wane across geological time, forming new channels as old ones dried and carving floodplains where forests took root and dinosaurs migrated. Some of the most surprising discoveries have come from places where technology and chance intersect. A satellite image revealing a faint circular feature led researchers to an ancient oxbow lake, where they found clusters of fish fossils preserved exactly where they died as the water vanished. At another site, radar detected a buried basin that turned out to be the remnants of a vast Cretaceous wetland, its mudstone layers rich with the pollen of extinct plant species. Each new finding adds another layer of detail, allowing scientists to reconstruct not only the landscape but the rhythms of life that once animated it. Piece by piece, this growing map of the ancient Sahara is revealing a world far more dynamic than anyone had imagined. What was once dismissed as empty desert is now recognized as a former heartland of biodiversity, a network of rivers and wetlands that supported vast communities of plants and animals. It is a story that could not have been told a century ago, when fossils were found only by luck and rivers were traced only where they cut through exposed rock. Today, with tools that can see beneath the sand and read the chemical signatures of time itself, that story is being written in extraordinary detail. The rivers will never return to their ancient courses, and the creatures that swam in them are long gone, but their memory is no longer buried. With every satellite pass, every radar scan, and every carefully unearthed fossil, the forgotten waterways of Cretaceous Africa emerge once more, traced across maps and reconstructed in laboratories. The dunes above them shift with the wind, but the story beneath grows clearer with each new discovery, revealing a world that water once shaped and that science is only now beginning to truly understand. Few creatures from Earth's deep past have stirred as much debate as Spinosaurus. Even in a lineage filled with predators of impossible size and power, this animal stands apart, refusing to fit neatly into the categories paleontologists once thought they understood. Its skull, long and narrow like that of a crocodile, suggests one type of lifestyle. Its immense sail, rising like the keel of a ship from its spine, hints at another. Its limbs, its bones, even the shape of its tail seem to contradict one another, combining features seen nowhere else in the dinosaur world. It is this tension, this sense of a creature that should not exist yet did, that fuels one of the most enduring scientific debates of our time. At the center of the argument is a deceptively simple question: what did Spinosaurus actually do? Nearly every part of its anatomy points toward an unusual way of life, but how those pieces fit together is far from settled. Some researchers see it as the first truly semi-aquatic dinosaur, one that spent much of its time in the water, swimming through ancient rivers in pursuit of fish. Others argue that while it may have been comfortable near water, it was still, at its core, a terrestrial hunter that waded rather than swam. Each interpretation paints a radically different picture of how this predator lived, moved, and hunted, and each is supported by evidence. Much of the modern debate focuses on locomotion. Several teams have proposed that Spinosaurus used its powerful, laterally flattened tail to propel itself through water in much the same way as crocodilians do today. Laboratory tests with scale models, combined with biomechanical simulations, show that such a tail could have generated thrust. Its dense limb bones, too, seem consistent with a body designed to overcome buoyancy, allowing it to submerge more easily. Supporters of the aquatic hypothesis argue that these traits are more than coincidental. They see them as part of a coherent suite of adaptations, pointing to an animal that was not merely an opportunistic wader, but a predator that actively hunted beneath the surface. Skeptics counter that the evidence does not yet prove this lifestyle. Some biomechanical models suggest that even with its paddle-like tail, Spinosaurus would have been a relatively inefficient swimmer compared to modern aquatic predators. Its torso was large and top-heavy, and its limbs, while shortened, still appear suited to bearing weight on land. These scientists argue that Spinosaurus may have been more like a gigantic stork or heron, wading into shallow waters and striking at fish with its long jaws rather than chasing them through deeper channels. In their view, the animal's adaptations reflect a compromise, an amphibious existence that relied as much on patience and ambush as on pursuit. Posture adds another layer of uncertainty. Debate continues over whether Spinosaurus walked primarily on two legs, like other large theropods, or shifted its weight onto all fours to support its front-heavy body. Each interpretation has implications for how it moved between water and land, how it hunted, and even how it interacted with its environment. A bipedal Spinosaurus might have roamed far from rivers, scavenging carcasses, or preying on terrestrial animals. A quadrupedal stance suggests a creature more bound to water's edge, less agile on land, but perhaps more stable in shallow channels. Even the sail, one of its most iconic features, remains an open question. Some researchers believe it was a thermoregulatory structure, absorbing heat in the morning or shedding it in the midday sun. Others see it as a display device used to attract mates or signal dominance. A few have speculated that it might even have served a hydrodynamic role, helping to stabilize the animal as it maneuvered through water. Each idea has merit, and none has been conclusively proven. These disagreements extend beyond anatomy into the chemical traces left behind in fossils. Isotopic signatures in Spinosaurus teeth show a diet rich in aquatic prey, yet some samples also indicate terrestrial feeding. This ambiguity fuels further debate about how much time the dinosaur spent in water versus on land. Was it a specialist that relied almost entirely on rivers and lakes, or a flexible hunter capable of exploiting a wide range of environments? What makes this scientific tug-of-war significant is not merely the fate of one dinosaur's reputation. It touches deeper questions about evolution itself. If Spinosaurus truly was a proficient swimmer, it would represent the first known case of a large theropod returning to a semi-aquatic lifestyle, a dramatic reversal of evolutionary trends. If, on the other hand, it was primarily terrestrial, it shows how far a predator could push anatomical specialization without fully abandoning the land. Each possibility reshapes how scientists think about dinosaur diversity, adaptation, and ecological roles. The discussion is far from over. Advances in imaging, biomechanical modeling, and chemical analysis continue to refine the arguments on both sides. New fossils, when they appear, are scrutinized in extraordinary detail, each vertebra or claw potentially shifting the balance of evidence. The debate has even become a proving ground for new methods, with paleontologists building robotic tails to test hydrodynamics or simulating muscle forces to estimate gait. Spinosaurus remains a creature of contradictions, a puzzle that refuses to resolve itself neatly. Its story is not one of definitive answers but of evolving hypotheses, each new discovery deepening rather than ending the conversation. In that ongoing search, scientists are reminded that the past is never fully settled. It is an ever-changing landscape, shaped as much by the questions we ask as by the bones we find. And Spinosaurus, enigmatic as ever, continues to stand at the crossroads of those questions, inviting us to look closer, think harder, and keep searching. Long before Spinosaurus stalked the rivers, or Sarcosuchus ambushed prey from the shallows, before the skies filled with pterosaurs and the waters churned with giant fish, there was another world at work beneath it all. It was a quieter, smaller world, one that did not roar or crush or dominate, yet it was this hidden realm that made everything else possible. It was the world of plants, microbes, and microscopic organisms, the silent architects of life's grand stage. The Cretaceous rivers did not simply flow across barren ground. Their banks were lined with dense vegetation, their floodplains thick with ferns, cycads, and flowering plants. These plants anchored the soil and slowed the rush of water, creating rich wetlands where nutrients could accumulate and sustain entire ecosystems. Their roots threaded deep into the sediment, holding it firm against erosion, while their leaves formed canopies that shaded the water and moderated its temperature. Fossilized plant remains reveal forests of conifers towering over the floodplains, their needles drifting into the water where they would break down and feed the food web. Beneath them grew low-lying horsetails and club mosses, some of them descendants of plants that had been shaping landscapes since before the age of dinosaurs began. This green world was far more than scenery. Every leaf, stem, and root was part of a vast nutrient engine. Plants absorbed carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen, helping regulate the climate and making the environment breathable for animals large and small. When they died, their decaying remains enriched the soil, fueling new growth and feeding microbes that thrived on the steady supply of organic matter. These microscopic organisms, too small to see with the naked eye, played an outsized role in shaping the river's chemistry. They broke down plant and animal remains into simpler compounds, releasing nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that sustained the next generation of plant life. Without these tiny recyclers, the cycle of growth and decay that supported the ecosystem would have ground to a halt. Even in the water, microbes and microscopic plants formed the foundation of the food web. Algae bloomed in the sunlight that filtered through the water's surface, turning dissolved nutrients into energy through photosynthesis. These simple organisms became food for small invertebrates like crustaceans and insect larvae, which in turn were eaten by fish. At every step, the energy that began with microscopic life climbed upward through the food chain, eventually sustaining the enormous predators that dominated the ecosystem. Spinosaurus may have been the most fearsome hunter in the river, but even it owed its survival to the work of organisms so small they would have been invisible to its eyes. The plant life of this ancient world also offers scientists important clues about the climate that shaped it. Fossil pollen and spores, preserved in layers of sediment, act like tiny time capsules, recording which plants lived where and when. By studying these microscopic grains under a microscope, paleobotanists can reconstruct the vegetation patterns of the past and track how they changed as the climate shifted. In some layers, the pollen of moisture-loving ferns and water lilies is abundant, suggesting warm, humid conditions with plentiful rainfall. In others, the presence of drought-tolerant plants points to drier periods when rivers shrank and wetlands receded. These fossilized traces go beyond cataloging ancient plant life. They help scientists understand the rhythms of the Cretaceous environment, revealing patterns of flood and drought, heat and cool, abundance and scarcity. Geochemical analyses of the sediments add even more detail. Ratios of carbon isotopes in plant material can reveal how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere, offering insights into the greenhouse conditions that shaped the climate. Traces of oxygen isotopes provide clues about rainfall patterns and seasonal cycles. Together, these tiny chemical fingerprints help scientists piece together the larger picture of how the rivers and their ecosystems functioned. It was not only plants and microbes that shaped the environment. Countless small creatures contributed to the hidden machinery of life. Burrowing worms and insect larvae aerated the soil, improving its structure and allowing roots to penetrate deeper. Freshwater mollusks filtered water as they fed, removing debris and helping maintain the clarity of rivers and lakes. Even the bodies of small animals, when they died, added nutrients back into the system, enriching the floodplains that supported larger plants and herbivores. The interactions among these countless small organisms created a delicate balance. Plants stabilized the land and fueled the food web. Microbes recycled nutrients and maintained the chemical balance of the rivers. Tiny invertebrates and burrowers kept the soil fertile and the water clean. Together, they built the ecological foundation on which the giants of the Cretaceous depended. In the fossil record, these small players often go unnoticed. Their remains are harder to find than the bones of dinosaurs or the teeth of crocodiles, and they rarely make headlines. Yet their presence is everywhere, written into the pollen, trapped in ancient sediments, the isotopic signatures preserved in rock, and the subtle traces of their activity in the layers of soil and mud. Without them, the rivers would have been sterile channels of water, incapable of supporting the teeming life that once filled their depths and banks. The story of the Cretaceous rivers is not just the story of colossal predators and dramatic battles. It is also the story of the hidden builders, the countless small lives that made the existence of those giants possible. Their work is still recorded in the rocks beneath the desert, a silent testimony to the power of the unseen and the indispensable role of the tiny in shaping the vast. The rivers of the Cretaceous are gone. Their channels are buried beneath sand, their floodplains erased, and their waters long vanished into the memory of the earth. Yet if you look closely at the rivers that still flow today, you can see fragments of that ancient world, still alive in the present. The ecosystems that once thrived in Africa's lost waterways did not disappear completely. They left behind echoes, passed down through millions of years of evolution, reflected in the bodies and behaviors of modern species. The Nile, winding northward across Africa before emptying into the Mediterranean, offers one of the most striking windows into that ancient past. It is a river shaped by cycles of flood and drought, lined with wetlands and seasonal floodplains, and teeming with life both above and below its surface. Along its banks, Nile crocodiles bask in the sun, their eyes just above the waterline, their bodies still and patient. They are among the oldest surviving reptile lineages on Earth, their ancestors stretching back to the time of the dinosaurs. And in their behavior, we can glimpse the strategies that ancient predators once used. Like Sarcosuchus of the Cretaceous, Nile crocodiles are ambush hunters. They wait motionless near the water's edge, their bodies nearly invisible beneath the surface, until an unsuspecting animal comes to drink. Then, with explosive power, they lunge, seizing their prey with a bite strong enough to crush bone. Their tactics have changed little in more than 100 million years because they do not need to. Patience, stealth, and sudden violence were as effective in the age of dinosaurs as they are today. In this way, every strike of a modern crocodile is a faint reenactment of ancient hunts that once played out along the vanished rivers of the Sahara. Beneath the surface, another ancient story unfolds. The Nile is home to some of the largest freshwater fish on Earth, including the African catfish, which can grow to over 6 feet in length. These giants patrol the river's depths, feeding on smaller fish, amphibians, and even birds that fall into the water. Their sheer size and dominance mirror the role once played by enormous fish like Mawsonia in the Cretaceous. Just as ancient predators adapted to exploit a river full of prey, so too have modern catfish become powerful forces within their ecosystems. Their presence helps shape the balance of life in the water, controlling populations and influencing the structure of the food web, much as their prehistoric counterparts once did. Even more surprising are the echoes of ancient life found in creatures that seem, at first glance, far removed from the age of dinosaurs. In the murky rivers of South America and Asia, freshwater dolphins navigate with precision, using echolocation to find prey in water where vision is limited. These mammals, descended from land-dwelling ancestors, represent an evolutionary path similar to the one taken by semi-aquatic reptiles like Spinosaurus. Both are examples of life adapting to a riverine environment by changing its body and senses to master a new world. In the case of river dolphins, streamlined bodies, flexible necks, and specialized sonar have replaced claws and conical teeth, but the underlying story is the same. The pull of the river has a way of reshaping life. Modern river ecosystems also echo the structure of their ancient predecessors. Seasonal flooding still transforms landscapes, replenishing nutrients, creating wetlands, and driving migrations. Just as Cretaceous rivers once dictated where plants could grow and where animals gathered, today's rivers continue to sculpt the patterns of life. Each year, when the Nile overflows its banks, it deposits layers of rich sediment that feed plant growth and sustain agriculture. This seasonal pulse mirrors the ancient cycles of flood and retreat that built the fertile floodplains of the past. The interactions between species in modern rivers also carry traces of an older order. In the Amazon, giant arapaima leap from the water to snatch birds, while black caimans patrol the shallows for unwary mammals. In the Ganges, gharials use their long, narrow jaws to snatch fish from the current, a strategy not unlike that of prehistoric piscivores. In rivers around the world, animals have converged on the same solutions again and again, refining hunting strategies, body shapes, and behaviors first tested in deep time. The persistence of these patterns shows how powerful and enduring the forces of river ecosystems are. Even the landscape itself bears marks of the past. Many modern rivers still follow paths carved by ancient waterways, their courses guided by the same geological structures that once directed Cretaceous streams. Some floodplains are built on sediments laid down by rivers that flowed when dinosaurs ruled the earth. In this way, the work done by water millions of years ago still shapes where forests grow, where cities rise, and where species thrive today. The rivers we know are not relics but continuations, chapters in a story that has been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years. The creatures that stalk their banks, swim in their depths, and soar above their surfaces are participants in a drama far older than humanity. Each hunt, migration, and flood is part of a pattern that began long before the Sahara turned to sand. Though the ancient rivers are gone, their influence flows on. It runs through the crocodile's patient hunt, the catfish's silent glide, the dolphin's whispered clicks beneath the surface. It shapes the rise and fall of waters and the migrations of creatures that depend on them. The echoes of that lost world are not distant or faint. They ripple all around us, hidden in plain sight, wherever water still carves its way across the land. Across Earth's long history, rivers have been far more than simple veins of water winding through the land. They have been crucibles of change, catalysts for innovation, and relentless forces of transformation. Where oceans provide stability and vastness, rivers bring chaos and flux. They swell and shrink, vanish and return, shift their courses without warning. They carve landscapes anew and isolate fragments of habitat, and in doing so, they push life to invent itself again and again. Some of the earliest and most profound evolutionary milestones began along their banks. More than 360 million years ago, during the Devonian period, the edges of ancient rivers and floodplains became staging grounds for one of the boldest experiments in the history of life. Fish that once swam freely through waterlogged ecosystems found themselves stranded in pools that shrank as seasonal droughts took hold. Those that survived did so because they were different. They had fins strong enough to push them across muddy ground, or primitive lungs that could gulp air from above the surface. Over countless generations, these small advantages became transformative. Fins hardened into limbs, gills were joined by lungs, and vertebrates took their first uncertain steps onto land. The transition was neither quick nor simple. Early amphibians remained tethered to the river margins that had shaped them, still dependent on water to breed and keep their skin moist. But as rivers shifted their courses and floodplains dried, new pressures emerged. Some of these pioneering vertebrates evolved tougher, water-resistant skin that allowed them to venture farther from the shoreline. Others developed new reproductive strategies that freed them from laying eggs in water. These incremental changes, each a response to the restless behavior of rivers, paved the way for reptiles, mammals, and eventually birds, the full flowering of terrestrial life that now covers the continents. Rivers continued to act as evolutionary accelerators long after vertebrates had conquered land. As tectonic plates drifted and climates changed, rivers carved through new landscapes and created isolated pockets of habitat. Within those pockets, life diverged. Fish trapped in one branch of a river adapted to fast-flowing currents, developing streamlined bodies and powerful tails. Others, marooned in still backwaters, evolved flattened bodies for ambush hunting or specialized jaws for sifting sediment. Even insects and amphibians followed separate evolutionary paths when a channel shifted or a floodplain fractured, producing new species in a geological blink of time. The river itself was not merely a stage for life, it was an architect, dividing and shaping populations into distinct evolutionary experiments. This shaping force was not limited to freshwater inhabitants. Rivers also acted as gateways that lured land dwellers back into aquatic realms. Around 50 million years ago, in the early Eocene, hoofed mammals that grazed along riverbanks began to spend more time in shallow water. They fed on fish and aquatic plants, first wading, then swimming. Over millions of years, their limbs transformed into flippers, their nostrils shifted to the tops of their skulls, and their bodies streamlined into forms suited for open water. These were the ancestors of whales and dolphins, animals that today dominate the oceans, but still carry traces of their riverbank origins in their anatomy and embryonic development. Their closest living relatives, the semi-aquatic hippopotamuses, still live where their story began, in the shifting margins between land and freshwater. Rivers have also shaped life in subtler, but equally dramatic ways. They act as corridors, allowing species to disperse across continents and encounter new environments. They isolate populations when they change course, driving speciation. They bring nutrients from the mountains to the sea, fueling plankton blooms that sustain marine ecosystems. And during ice ages, when glaciers locked much of the world's water away, rivers created refuges, ribbons of flowing life, where plants and animals could persist until the climate warmed again. Even in the modern world, the evolutionary influence of rivers has not diminished. Salmon are able to shift between freshwater and saltwater because their ancestors evolved physiological flexibility to navigate riverine migrations. River dolphins, descendants of oceanic lineages, have evolved echolocation tuned for murky currents and sonar-reflective prey. Cichlid fish isolated in separate tributaries of the same river can evolve into distinct species within just a few thousand generations. Each of these examples is a living echo of the forces that shaped life in the deep past. The power of rivers lies not simply in the habitats they provide, but in their unpredictability. Oceans change slowly, deserts remain deserts, and forests grow and die in cycles that are often stable over long timescales. Rivers, by contrast, are never still. They flood and vanish, cut new channels, and rearrange the very fabric of the landscapes they flow through. They force organisms to confront uncertainty, and in that confrontation, they spark creativity. Life that thrives along their banks must learn to adapt to change itself, and in doing so, it often becomes something entirely new. From the first fish that crawled out of Devonian shallows to the whales that glide through the modern seas, the legacy of rivers runs through every branch of the tree of life. Their restlessness has shaped bodies, rewritten behaviors, and redrawn the boundaries of possibility. And though the courses they carve may dry or shift, their role as engines of evolution continues, as relentless and transformative as the water that has always shaped the world. For all that paleontology has revealed about the vanished river worlds of the Cretaceous, most of their story remains hidden in silence. We can trace the shape of the channels that once cut across ancient landscapes, and we can name the creatures that swam through their depths. We can measure their bones, map their habitats, and even model their climate. But these discoveries, vast as they are fragments of a much larger whole. They are outlines without motion, diagrams without behavior, the living details of how these ecosystems truly functioned. The rhythms, relationships, and instincts that shaped daily life are still mostly beyond our reach. One of the most stubborn mysteries lies in how these ancient animals reproduced and raised their young. The fossil record gives us spectacular skeletons, but almost nothing of what happened before birth or after hatching. We do not yet know if the colossal Spinosaurus built nests from vegetation like modern crocodiles, or if it buried its eggs in warm sandbanks. No eggs or nesting sites can be definitively attributed to it, and without them, we cannot say how many offspring it produced, how they were protected, or how vulnerable they were in their first days of life. The same silence surrounds Sarcosuchus, whose hatchlings might have stayed close to their mother's watchful presence, or scattered immediately into the shallows. Even the great fish that dominated the waterways remain elusive in this regard. Did they release clouds of eggs downstream like sturgeon, relying on numbers for survival, or did they seek out quiet floodplains to spawn and guard their young? The absence of reproductive evidence leaves enormous gaps in our understanding of population dynamics. Without knowing how many offspring these species produced or how many survived to adulthood, we cannot yet model how resilient they were to environmental change or competition. A single discovery, a nest preserved in floodplain sediment, or a cluster of hatchling bones, could radically change how we see their lives and how these ecosystems were sustained across generations. Behavior is another realm where our knowledge thins into speculation. Bones can hint at movement, but they cannot show social interaction or hunting strategy. Did Spinosaurus patrol the rivers as a solitary predator, or did it tolerate others of its kind within overlapping territories? Were riverbanks fiercely defended, or did individuals range freely along hundreds of miles of waterways? And how did these predators interact with one another when their territories overlapped through violent confrontation, ritual displays, or subtle communication? Even the behavior of herbivorous dinosaurs remains elusive. Their footprints trace migration routes to the water's edge, but we do not know if they arrived in tightly organized herds loose aggregations, or seasonal gatherings that coincided with the wettest months of the year. Migration itself may hold some of the most important unanswered questions. Geological evidence hints that many river dwellers may not have been permanent residents. Certain fish species could have followed annual cycles, swimming upstream to spawn and downstream to feed, much like salmon do today. Large reptiles might have shifted their ranges with the rise and fall of water levels, abandoning dried-out channels in favor of newly flooded floodplains. Even the great dinosaurs may have followed the rivers like green corridors, traversing continents in search of food and water. Yet, without direct evidence, isotopic signatures locked in bone chemistry, or trackways stretching across entire landscapes, these remain hypotheses rather than facts. Even more elusive are the subtleties of daily life. We do not know the sounds that rippled across the floodplains at dawn, or the calls that echoed through the humid air after rainfall. We cannot say whether Spinosaurus was a diurnal hunter that stalked fish in daylight, or a nocturnal prowler that relied on moonlit waters to conceal its approach. The role of its sail remains uncertain too. Was it a thermoregulatory organ, capturing morning heat before the hunt began, or did it serve in courtship rituals that unfolded in elaborate visual displays? The fossil record preserves bones but not behaviors, and in that silence, the intimate details of courtship, communication, and territorial display are lost. Even the rivers themselves still hold secrets. We do not yet fully understand how their courses shifted across millions of years, or how their seasonal pulses shaped the distribution of life. The frequency of catastrophic floods, the length of droughts, and the precise timing of monsoonal rhythms remain locked in the sediments. New techniques in isotope geochemistry and high-resolution climate modeling may one day allow scientists to reconstruct these cycles with greater precision, but for now, they remain shadows on the edge of knowledge. Each unanswered question offers the promise of discovery. A perfectly preserved nesting site could reveal how dinosaurs cared for their young. A long, continuous trackway might capture the seasonal migrations of a herd. Chemical traces in fossilized teeth could confirm journeys across vast distances, while new imaging technologies might even detect soft tissue remnants that hint at behavior. Every layer of sand, every forgotten fossil bed, might still hold evidence that could transform speculation into certainty. Yet even with all the tools of modern science, some mysteries may remain beyond our grasp. Behavior vanishes more easily than bone, and entire life cycles can pass without leaving a trace in stone. What we hold now is a partial story, a mosaic of what once was. The missing pieces are not failures of science, but reminders of nature's complexity, of how much is lost to time and how much remains to be found. And within those gaps lies the quiet possibility that the most extraordinary discoveries, the ones that reveal not just how these creatures looked, but how they lived, are still waiting, hidden beneath the sand. For most of its history, paleontology has been a science of fragments and patience. A shard of bone weathered out of rock, a single tooth in a layer of sandstone, a faint imprint of scales or feathers from such scraps, entire worlds were imagined. The process was painstaking and often uncertain, shaped by careful observation and informed guesswork. But a quiet revolution is underway. The way we study ancient life is changing, not just through sharper tools or better microscopes, but through technologies that can uncover patterns invisible to the human eye and read the deep past with a precision that once seemed impossible. In this new era, even the smallest fossil fragment or faintest chemical trace can reveal stories that were beyond reach only a decade ago. At the heart of this transformation is artificial intelligence. Paleontology today produces vast oceans of data, high-resolution scans, microscopic imagery, chemical analyses, and three-dimensional reconstructions, far too complex for a single researcher or even a team to parse alone. Machine learning algorithms, trained to recognize patterns across thousands of samples, are now stepping into that role. They can detect minute differences in bone microstructure that reveal an animal's growth rate or seasonal stress. They can sort through scattered fossil fragments and predict which ones belong to the same skeleton, even when separated by miles of sediment. Some systems are being trained to reconstruct missing pieces of bones from incomplete specimens, predicting their original shapes with remarkable accuracy. In this way, AI is not just accelerating the pace of discovery, it is reshaping the very questions scientists can ask. The rise of predictive modeling is expanding that power even further. Algorithms can now simulate how ecosystems changed over millions of years, integrating fossil data with ancient climate records to recreate shifting river systems, migration corridors, and predator-prey dynamics. By feeding thousands of variables into these models, researchers can explore what-if scenarios, how species might have responded to sudden drought, how rivers carved new landscapes after tectonic uplift, or how evolutionary pressures changed as habitats fragmented. This is more than digital guesswork. These models are grounded in hard data and can reveal patterns that no field expedition could capture alone. Another frontier lies in isotope geochemistry, a field that has turned ancient bones and sediments into chemical time capsules. Every organism absorbs isotopes, slightly different forms of elements, from the environment, and those isotopes preserve clues about the world it lived in. Oxygen isotopes can record the temperature and salinity of ancient water. Carbon isotopes can trace the food webs that sustained an ecosystem, distinguishing between terrestrial plants and aquatic prey. Strontium isotopes, drawn from the bedrock of different regions, can reveal where an animal was born and how far it traveled over its lifetime. With these techniques, scientists are beginning to follow the movements of individual animals across entire continents and reconstruct migration routes that once stretched from one ancient river system to another. Some of the most ambitious projects aim to link these chemical records with machine learning. Algorithms can scan isotope datasets from hundreds of fossils and uncover migration patterns or dietary shifts invisible to traditional analysis. In the near future, this could allow researchers to map population movements over geological timescales, tracing how animals responded to changing river courses, shifting climates, or the rise and fall of sea levels. It may even reveal whether certain dinosaurs returned to the same nesting grounds year after year, or how predator territories expanded and contracted as waterways dried. Other emerging technologies promise to deepen this view even further. High-resolution synchrotron imaging can now peer inside fossils without damaging them, revealing the microscopic structure of tissues and growth rings that record seasonal changes. Quantum-level spectroscopy is being explored to detect organic residues, pigments, proteins, or biomolecules that could shed light on coloration, metabolism, or even sensory adaptations. And advances in virtual reality and immersive modeling are beginning to place digital reconstructions of ancient ecosystems into interactive environments, where scientists can explore how animals moved, hunted, and interacted across dynamic landscapes. This technological shift is also transforming how paleontology is done as a science. Collaboration across disciplines is no longer optional but essential. Chemists analyze isotopic fingerprints, while data scientists build predictive models. Climate researchers simulate ancient rainfall patterns, and engineers design robotic replicas to test how extinct animals might have moved. Together, these approaches create a fuller picture than any one discipline could achieve. They also allow scientists to revisit old questions with new tools, sometimes overturning assumptions that have stood for decades. What makes this moment so exciting is that many of its discoveries have not yet happened. Artificial intelligence may uncover entirely new evolutionary trends hidden in fossil databases. Geochemical fingerprints may reveal migratory highways that spanned ancient continents. Advanced imaging might capture evidence of behavior-healed wounds, muscle attachments, or seasonal stress lines that would otherwise remain invisible. And discoveries from orbit, guided by satellite-based anomaly detection, may lead researchers to fossil sites that have lain untouched for tens of millions of years. The past, once reconstructed from scattered bones and fragments, is becoming a living, dynamic field of exploration. Every new dataset refined by AI, every isotopic clue traced across continents, every digital simulation of an extinct ecosystem brings us closer to understanding not just how ancient rivers shaped life, but how life itself adapted and evolved in response. The bones beneath the desert may never speak, but with these new tools, science is learning how to listen more deeply than ever before. And in their silent record, we may yet uncover stories that have waited hundreds of millions of years to be told. Across the deep history of Earth, water has always been the deciding force that shapes life's destiny. It cuts through stone, transforms continents, and draws the boundaries of where ecosystems thrive and where they fail. In the age of the Cretaceous rivers, it determined everything from the rise of apex predators to the distribution of entire plant communities. And now, in a very different world, water is once again emerging as the defining element in humanity's future. The story written in the vanished waterways of prehistoric Africa is not only about the distant past, it is a scientific mirror revealing patterns and warnings that speak directly to the challenges we face today. The fossil record tells us that the world those rivers built was not destroyed by a single catastrophe, but by a chain of interconnected changes. A subtle shift in atmospheric circulation patterns weakened the seasonal monsoons. Gradual warming altered evaporation rates and rainfall distribution. Slow continental drift nudged entire regions into new climate zones, changing the way moisture moved through the air. None of these changes were catastrophic on their own, but together they altered the hydrological balance so profoundly that rivers that had carved continents for millions of years withered and disappeared. This is one of the clearest lessons from Earth's deep past. Water systems do not simply fail overnight. They unravel, piece by piece, when the delicate equilibrium between climate, land, and life begins to shift. Today, a similar unraveling is underway, though at a pace the ancient world never experienced. Human activity has compressed natural timescales, accelerating processes that once unfolded over millions of years into mere decades. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, which influence global circulation and precipitation, are rising at rates unprecedented in geological history. This shift is already transforming the planet's water cycle. Many of the world's great rivers, from the Colorado in North America to the Yangtze in Asia, now experience prolonged seasonal shortages. Their flows are declining, not only because of reduced rainfall, but also because snowpacks and glaciers that once fed them are melting too quickly or disappearing altogether. Groundwater, too, is following a trajectory that echoes the fate of the Cretaceous rivers. Aquifers that took tens of thousands of years to fill are being drained in mere decades to irrigate crops and supply cities. As their levels drop, springs dry up and wetlands vanish, erasing entire ecosystems. What happened naturally over millions of years in the ancient Sahara is now happening through human actions on a timescale shorter than a single human lifetime. The ecological consequences of these shifts are strikingly familiar. In the fossil record, the drying of ancient river systems caused the disappearance of aquatic species first. Fish and amphibians lost their habitats, followed by predators that depended on them. Vegetation patterns changed, and herbivores were forced to migrate or starve. Modern ecosystems are responding in much the same way. As rivers and lakes shrink, fish populations crash, rippling up the food chain to affect birds, mammals, and humans. Wetlands that once filtered water and absorbed floods are turning into barren ground, leaving landscapes more vulnerable to droughts and storms. Even migratory species, whose life cycles depend on predictable water availability, are losing the ancient pathways that guided them for millennia. The parallels extend beyond biology into human society. Just as the Cretaceous rivers shaped the distribution of life across continents, modern rivers shape the distribution of people, agriculture, and industry. Yet some of the same vulnerabilities persist. Cities that rely on glacial meltwater face uncertain futures as ice reserves shrink. Farming regions built around stable river flows must now contend with erratic rainfall and prolonged dry spells. Nations that share water resources are increasingly drawn into conflict as supplies dwindle. In this sense, the story of the Cretaceous rivers is not simply a lesson about nature. It is a case study in the cascading consequences of hydrological change. These ancient patterns also offer valuable guidance for adaptation. Fossils show that some species survived the drying of the rivers by shifting their ranges, diversifying their diets, or exploiting new habitats. Modern societies can learn from this resilience. Urban planners are beginning to redesign cities to capture and recycle water more efficiently. Engineers are developing technologies to desalinate seawater and purify wastewater on a large scale. Agricultural scientists are breeding crops that require less water and can withstand greater variability in climate. On a larger scale, efforts to restore wetlands, reconnect floodplains, and protect watersheds mimic the natural processes that once sustained ancient ecosystems, even as conditions changed. The most critical lesson of all is that water security is inseparable from climate stability. The collapse of the Cretaceous rivers was driven by climate shifts that took place over millions of years, yet even those changes were enough to erase one of Earth's most vibrant ecosystems. Today's changes are unfolding far faster, and the consequences could be just as profound. By studying how ancient systems responded to environmental stress, scientists can better predict how modern water networks might behave in a warmer world, how rivers might shift, how rainfall might migrate, and how ecosystems might reorganize in response. The story buried beneath the Sahara is not a distant curiosity. It is a scientific warning, written in stone and sediment, of what happens when water, the planet's most vital resource, begins to disappear. And it is a reminder that, just as life once adapted to a changing hydrological world, we too must learn to understand, anticipate, and reshape our relationship with water before the lessons of deep time become our reality once again. There is a strange kind of illusion that life often creates when it reaches its peak. To stand in the middle of an ecosystem at its height is to believe, instinctively, that it will last forever. The rivers will keep flowing, the forests will keep growing, and the endless cycle of growth and decay will continue, unchanged, for as long as the earth itself endures. Yet, the rocks and sediments beneath our feet tell a different story. They show that even the most flourishing worlds are temporary. They do not end with a single blow. They unravel slowly, often so quietly that the living never realize what is happening until it is too late. In the heart of the Cretaceous, northern Africa was one of those worlds. It was not just a landscape but an intricate living machine, powered by water and sunlight. Vast rivers twisted across floodplains, branching into deltas that fanned out into wetlands, stretching beyond the horizon. Their banks were lined with dense forests of ferns and towering conifers. Herds of herbivorous dinosaurs traced predictable routes along the water's edge, their migrations carving pathways through the undergrowth. Predators, some longer than school buses, patrolled the shallows or stalked the plains nearby. Crocodilians lounged in the heat, waiting for fish that darted beneath the surface. Insects swarmed, amphibians croaked from reed-choked pools, and the air was alive with the calls of pterosaurs wheeling overhead. It was a world overflowing with life, so balanced and abundant that it seemed untouchable. The collapse of such a system did not arrive like a disaster from the sky. There was no single moment when everything changed. Instead, it began in the margins, where change is hardest to notice. Rainfall that had once arrived like clockwork began to shift, first by days, then by weeks, until seasons no longer followed the rhythms that had shaped life for millions of years. River channels narrowed. Some years, the floods never came at all. Pools that had once lasted for months dried within weeks, and as water retreated, so did the forests, their roots no longer able to reach what they needed. The transformation was so slow that no single generation of creatures could perceive it. Each was born into a world slightly more fragile than the one before, and each adapted just enough to survive within it. But slow change has a way of gathering momentum. A slight decrease in rainfall meant smaller rivers. Smaller rivers meant fewer fish. Fewer fish meant predators that once thrived in abundance now struggled to find food. The disappearance of prey rippled outward through the web of life. Species that had lived side by side for millions of years began to vanish, not in a sudden wave, but one by one, like the steady dimming of stars. Even the land itself began to change. As plant roots vanished, soils dried and loosened. Winds carried sand from faraway deserts, spreading it like a creeping tide across the floodplains. Year by year, the green world shrank, replaced by open scrubland and eventually bare ground. By the time the rivers themselves were gone, the transformation was complete. The floodplains that had once echoed with the calls of reptiles and birds were silent. The wetlands that had thrived for ages were nothing more than shallow depressions that filled briefly after rare rains. Fossil evidence suggests that some species clung on as long as they could, adapting to smaller habitats or migrating in search of new ones. But many simply disappeared, their last traces buried beneath layers of wind-blown sediment. What had once been a continuous landscape of life was now a scattered patchwork of survivors. The quietness of this collapse is one of its most striking features. There was no singular extinction event, no asteroid impact, or massive volcanic eruption to draw a line between before and after. Instead, life simply faded from places where it had once flourished. This pattern is written all across the fossil record. Coral reefs that once spanned entire coastlines were reduced to barren limestone as oceans warmed and acidified. Inland seas teeming with life dried up grain by grain, leaving behind beds of cracked mud. Even the great carboniferous forests, which had stretched from horizon to horizon, vanished not in a fiery catastrophe, but as subtle shifts in humidity and temperature push them beyond their limits. This is what fragility truly looks like. It is not dramatic or explosive. It is incremental, quiet, and almost invisible while it is happening. Each piece of the system depends on another, and when one part weakens, the others follow. The most complex ecosystems are often the most vulnerable because their balance relies on countless small interactions working in harmony. Remove enough of them, and the entire structure collapses under its own weight, even if nothing catastrophic ever occurs. The rivers of Cretaceous Africa remind us that the distance between abundance and emptiness can be alarmingly short. A landscape that once supported thousands of species can become a desert within the span of a few million years, its richness erased so thoroughly that future generations might never guess it existed. What was once lush, loud, and alive can become barren and silent, not because it was destroyed, but because the conditions that sustained it quietly slipped away. Beneath the sands of the Sahara, the remains of that vanished world still lie waiting vertebrae of vanished giants, ripple marks from forgotten streams, the impressions of leaves from forests that no longer exist. They are fragments of a reality that once seemed permanent, and they are reminders that even the grandest worlds are far more delicate than they appear, their futures written not in sudden calamities, but in the slow, silent drift of time. If you walk into the heart of the Sahara today, the silence seems absolute. The wind moves in long, patient breaths, shaping dunes that rise and fall like the surface of a still ocean. The sun bleaches the land into pale gold and ochre, and the horizon stretches so far it feels as if the world itself has stopped moving. It is a place that seems empty, a place where nothing could have ever thrived. Yet beneath those endless sands lies a hidden archive of memory, a record not written in ink or parchment but in stone, sealed away grain by grain over millions of years. Beneath the shifting dunes are bones older than any human memory, pressed into rock with the weight of deep time. They belong to creatures that once swam where no water flows now, to plants that once anchored their roots, where only wind now stirs. Each fossil is a fragment of a message, carried across millions of years to reach us. A single vertebra speaks of a body built for power and grace. A pattern of ripple marks frozen in sandstone recalls the steady movement of water across a riverbed. Even the tiniest impression of a leaf holds the memory of a forest canopy that once filtered sunlight through its branches. Together, these fragments form something greater than a record of what once was. They are the physical echoes of a vanished world, evidence that the land beneath our feet has not always been barren. They tell us that here, in what seems the most inhospitable of deserts, rivers once coursed through the earth with unstoppable energy. They fed floodplains that teemed with life. They shaped the paths of great predators and guided the migrations of immense herbivores. They supported forests thick with ferns and cycads and nurtured waters where ancient fish and reptiles thrived. Each fossil unearthed is a small part of that story, a voice from the past, still speaking across the silence. Some of these voices carry the weight of extraordinary creatures. The heavy bones of Spinosaurus hint at a hunter unlike any other, one that traded the open plains for shallow waters and evolved to pursue prey beneath the surface. Crocodilian skulls, larger than any alive today, record the presence of ambush predators that ruled the edges of rivers. Delicate fish scales, pressed into layers of silt, preserve the memory of swift schools that once flashed beneath the sunlit surface. Even the preserved impressions of plants and insects speak of a complex and dynamic ecosystem woven together by the movement of water. Yet fossils also speak in subtler ways. They tell stories that no living witness ever recorded. A cluster of eggshell fragments, scattered and incomplete, suggests a nesting site long vanished. Patterns in bone chemistry reveal ancient migrations that span distances across a landscape now erased. The microscopic structure of fossilized wood preserves evidence of seasonal cycles that shaped growth and decay. These details do more than reconstruct an environment. They show how life itself leaves behind traces of its passing, how every breath and movement becomes part of the geological record. The landscape, too, holds its memory. Buried river channels still trace their paths beneath the desert, their curves and branches etched into the subsurface like veins in stone. Layers of sediment hold the story of ancient floods and droughts, recording how the waters once rose and fell with the rhythm of the planet's shifting climate. Even the minerals that replaced bone and shell carry within them the chemical fingerprints of the world that once was the temperature of the water, the composition of the atmosphere, the distant sources of sediments carried by ancient streams. All of it is a kind of whisper, a quiet conversation between past and present. The fossils do not warn or instruct. They do not cry out in alarm. Instead, they simply speak, patiently and persistently, of what once existed. They remind us that the world is never static, that landscapes we take for granted as permanent are only chapters in a much longer story. They show that life's traces linger far beyond the moment of their creation, carried forward by time until someone, somewhere, is ready to read them. Much of that story is still hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Each new fossil that surfaces adds a new sentence, a new phrase to the narrative. Together, they build a deeper understanding not just of how life once looked, but of how it functioned, how it adapted, and how it endured. They allow us to see the continuity between what was and what is, to trace the lineage of modern species back to ancestors that swam in vanished rivers and walked along forgotten floodplains. And so, the Sahara is not silent after all. Beneath its surface, the earth is speaking, quietly but clearly, telling us of a world that once thrived where none seems possible now. Every layer of stone is a page, every fossil is a word, and if we listen with enough patience, the desert will tell us not only what it once was, but also that nothing in nature is truly lost. The rivers are gone, the forests are gone, the creatures are gone, but their memory endures, whispered gently beneath the sand, waiting for us to hear it.